I am Victor. I am 72 years old, and I spent 40 years hunting down the worst financial criminals in America for the Internal Revenue Service. My daughter thought she was marrying a billionaire tech genius, but at her engagement party while the champagne flowed and the cameras flashed, her future husband stepped outside to take a phone call. That was when my brilliant, beautiful daughter grabbed my arm, her hands trembling like leaves in a winter storm, and whispered 5 words that made my blood run cold. Dad, please investigate him. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe a father's intuition is never wrong. The engagement party was held at a country club in the wealthiest part of Atlanta. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling and waiters in crisp white shirts walked around carrying trays of caviar and champagne that cost more than my first car. I stood in the corner wearing a simple gray suit I bought off the rack 20 years ago. To the room full of tech investors, venture capitalists, and socialites, I was just the modest working-class black father of the bride. I played the part perfectly. I hunched my shoulders slightly, walked with a slow, deliberate limp, and smiled kindly at anyone who made eye contact. No one in that room knew that I had retired as an elite criminal investigator for the federal government. No one knew that the old man sipping sparkling water had brought down cartels, corrupt politicians, and offshore money laundering syndicates. And absolutely no one knew that my late wife Vivian and I had quietly amassed a $20 million fortune through decades of aggressive anonymous investments. I lived in my old house and drove my rusty truck because true power does not need to show off. True power watches, and I was watching Preston Sterling. Preston was 35 years old, tall blonde, and wore a custom-tailored Italian suit that screamed new money. He was the CEO of some software startup that was supposedly about to change the world. From the moment he started dating my daughter Maya, he carried himself with an unbearable arrogance. He acted like a white savior who had bravely swooped in to rescue my daughter from a life of mediocrity. He loved to tell his friends how Maya grew up in a modest neighborhood, completely ignoring the fact that she was a brilliant 32-year-old trauma surgeon who had earned her medical degree on a full academic scholarship. He treated her success as if it were an accessory to his own greatness. Throughout the evening, Preston paraded Maya around the room like a trophy. I watched them from my quiet corner, analyzing his body language. He smiled too much. He laughed too loudly. His eyes were constantly darting toward the entrance as if he was expecting someone he did not want to see. Eventually, Preston left his group of investors and walked over to me. He had a glass of scotch in one hand and a smug, condescending smirk on his face. "Enjoying the party, Victor?" he asked, speaking slowly and loudly the way you speak to a child. "I know this is a lot fancier than what you are used to. Make sure you try the lobster. It is imported." "It is a beautiful party, Preston," I replied, keeping my voice soft and raspy. "You have been very generous." He chuckled, taking a sip of his drink. "Well, Maya deserves the best. I promised her I would take care of her, and I always deliver. By the way, Victor, could you do me a huge favor?" He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and shoved it into my hand. "I gave the valet the keys to my Porsche earlier," he said, not even looking me in the eye. "Could you go out to the front and make sure the kid parked it in the VIP spot near the cameras? I do not want anyone scratching the paint. Keep the change for your trouble." For a fraction of a second, my federal agent instincts flared. I calculated the exact amount of force it would take to snap his wrist. Here was a man treating his future father-in-law, a man who possessed 10 times his supposed net worth, like a hired errand boy. But I did not react. I did not let my mask slip. I simply nodded, gave him a warm, toothy smile, and folded the bill into my pocket. "Of course, Preston," I said. "I will go check on it right now." He patted my shoulder patronizingly and turned away. I started to walk toward the exit, playing the role of the obedient old man perfectly. But just as I reached the grand double doors of the ballroom, Preston's cell phone rang. I stopped and watched his reflection in the glass of the door. When he looked at the caller ID, his entire demeanor changed. The fake arrogant smile vanished. The color drained from his face. He looked terrified. He immediately shoved his way through the crowd, heading for the heavy glass doors that led to the outdoor patio. Maya was standing near the ice sculpture watching him leave. As soon as the patio door closed behind Preston, the elegant, confident posture of my daughter collapsed. She looked around frantically, spotted me near the exit, and practically ran across the ballroom. When she reached me, she did not hug me. She grabbed my forearm and I felt a shock go through my system. Her hands were ice cold. She was trembling so violently that the champagne in the glass she was holding spilled over the rim and onto the marble floor. "Maya, baby, what is wrong?" I asked, dropping the frail old man act instantly. My voice was low, sharp, and authoritative. She looked up at me and I saw absolute terror in her eyes, the kind of terror I used to see in witnesses who were being targeted by the mob. Her breathing was shallow. She glanced at the patio doors, making sure Preston was still outside. "Dad," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Dad, please investigate him." The words hit me like a physical blow. Investigate him. She did not say talk to him. She did not say something is wrong with the wedding. She specifically used the word investigate. She knew what I used to do for a living. She knew I had resources. "Maya, what are you talking about?" I demanded quietly, pulling her slightly behind a decorative pillar to shield her from the crowd. "What did he do? Are you in danger?" She opened her mouth to speak. A tear escaped her eye and rolled down her perfectly powdered cheek. "He is not who he says he is, Dad. I found something. He told me if I cancel the wedding, he will, darling." The voice cut through the air like a whip. We both flinched. Preston was standing just a few feet away. His phone was back in his pocket, but the terror I had seen on his face earlier had been replaced by a dark, furious intensity. He marched over to us, his eyes fixed dead on Maya. He did not even acknowledge my presence. He stepped into Maya's personal space, crowding her against the pillar. He reached out and wrapped his large hand around the back of her neck. To the rest of the room, it looked like a passionate, affectionate gesture from a loving fiancé. But I saw his knuckles turn white. I saw the way his thumb pressed hard against the base of her skull. It was a grip designed to control. It was a threat. "What are we whispering about in the corner?" Preston asked, his voice dripping with artificial sweetness. Maya froze. The life completely left her eyes. The brilliant, fearless surgeon who saved lives in the emergency room was suddenly reduced to a terrified hostage. "Nothing." "Preston," she stammered, forcing a fragile smile. "I was just telling my dad how much I love the floral arrangements." Preston's cold blue eyes shifted to me. His grip on her neck did not loosen. "Is that right, Victor?" I looked at his hand on my daughter. The urge to act was overwhelming. Every fatherly instinct screamed at me to grab him by the throat and throw him through the plate glass window. But I am not just a father. I am a predator who spent his life hunting dangerous men. If I caused a scene now, if I attacked him here, I would be arrested for assault. Maya would be left alone with him, and whatever threat he was holding over her head would be executed. You do not strike when you are blind. You gather your ammunition and then you obliterate your enemy. "Yes," I said, forcing my shoulders to slump again, bringing back the raspy, weak voice, just talking about the flowers. "It is a beautiful party, Preston. I should be getting home now. It is past my bedtime." Preston smirked, his arrogance returning. His grip on Maya finally relaxed. "Drive safe, Pops. Do not get lost on the way back to the suburbs." I nodded, gave Maya one last look, and walked out the front doors of the country club. I handed the valet the $100 bill Preston had given me and waited for my truck. When the rusted 1998 Ford F-150 pulled up, the valet looked at me with pity. I did not care. I climbed into the worn driver's seat, started the loud coughing engine, and drove out of the pristine country club gates. I drove for 2 miles until I reached an empty, dimly lit parking lot behind a closed-down grocery store. I put the truck in park and turned off the engine. The frail old man disappeared entirely. I sat up straight. My breathing slowed. My mind shifted into a gear I had not used since the day I retired from the agency. I reached under the passenger seat and pulled back the floor mat. I pressed my thumb against a biometric scanner hidden in the steel floorboard. A heavy metal compartment clicked open. Inside rested a matte black military-grade encrypted laptop that still had direct backdoor access to federal databases. I pulled the laptop out, flipped open the screen, and typed in a 64-character decryption password. The screen illuminated the dark cabin of my truck with a cold blue light. Preston Sterling thought he was dealing with an ignorant, broke old man from the wrong side of the tracks. He thought he could threaten my daughter and use my family as props in his sick little game. I cracked my knuckles and opened the public records search terminal. He was about to find out that the worst mistake you can make in this world is insulting a quiet man who knows how to follow the money. The hunt had officially begun. The blue glow of the encrypted laptop screen washed over my face in the cold, dark cab of my rusted truck. For 40 years, my job was to follow the money. Criminals always lie. They build massive facades of wealth and success to intimidate everyone around them. But the money never lies. The numbers tell the absolute truth. I typed Preston Sterling into the federal database query. I bypassed the standard public search protocols and went straight into the restricted financial crime enforcement network. I still had my active security clearances. The agency never truly cuts off its top hunters. I routed my connection through a proxy server in Switzerland and began pulling the tax returns, corporate filings, and bank statements for Preston's so-called billion-dollar tech startup. The company was named Sterling Innovations. He had registered it in Delaware to hide the ownership structure, a standard move for someone trying to project an illusion. But when I traced the employer identification number through the federal treasury nodes, the cracks instantly appeared. The facade crumbled in less than 5 minutes. Sterling Innovations was nothing but smoke and mirrors. There was no manufacturing facility. There was no proprietary software patent. There was no real payroll. He had 20 employees listed, but most of them were unpaid interns and independent contractors working on deferred compensation contracts. He claimed to have a billion-dollar valuation based on a single round of seed funding he secured 3 years ago. But when I looked at the corporate accounts, the truth was staggering. He had zero liquidity. The seed money was completely gone. He had blown through $15 million in extravagant marketing events, leased luxury cars, and a penthouse office suite that cost a fortune just to maintain the illusion of success. He was completely mathematically broke. But a broke man does not terrify a trauma surgeon. A broke man does not grab his fiancée by the back of the neck with the cold grip of an enforcer. If Preston was simply a failed businessman, Maya would have just dumped him. She was fiercely independent. Something much darker was keeping her trapped in this engagement. I needed to see his internal ledgers. I needed the encrypted emails, the private communications he kept completely off the federal radar. I could not get those from my truck. I had to get them directly from the source. The next morning, I drove to the financial district of Atlanta. Sterling Innovations occupied the top floor of a sleek, modern skyscraper made entirely of glass and steel. I needed a reason to be there, and I needed to be completely invisible. In corporate America, nothing is more invisible than a slow-moving, elderly black man running a menial errand. I put on my faded corduroy pants, a plaid button-down shirt that was one size too large, and a worn-out flat cap. I packed a brown paper grocery bag with a plastic container of homemade baked ziti. I looked exactly like a harmless, confused grandfather dropping off lunch for a relative. I walked into the grand marble lobby of the skyscraper. The security guard at the front desk barely glanced at me as I joined a crowd of people stepping into the elevator. When the doors opened on the top floor, I stepped out into a hyper-modern reception area. The Sterling Innovations logo was etched into a massive slab of frosted glass. The receptionist, a young woman with expensive hair and a wireless headset, looked at me like I was a lost tourist who had wandered into the wrong dimension. I shuffled my feet, letting my posture slump. I forced my hands to tremble slightly as I approached her desk. I smiled my best confused, harmless smile. "Hello there, miss," I said, keeping my voice soft and raspy. "I am looking for my future son-in-law. His name is Preston Sterling. I brought him some lunch. My daughter Maya told me he works too hard and forgets to eat." The receptionist hesitated. Her hands hovered over her keyboard. She clearly did not want to bother the CEO of the company, but she also did not want to cause a scene with a fragile old man in the middle of her pristine lobby. She gave me a tight, polite smile and pointed to a sleek leather sofa. "Mr. Sterling is in a very important board meeting right now, sir," she said. "If you want to wait over there, I can let his executive assistant know you are here." "Thank you kindly," I replied, shuffling over to the sofa. I did not sit down. I observed. The layout of the office was exactly what I needed. Preston's executive assistant sat about 20 feet away behind a low, frosted glass partition. She had direct access to his calendar, his private network, and the internal server drives. I watched her type furiously for 2 minutes. Then her desk phone rang. She answered it, nodded, stood up, and grabbed her coffee mug. She walked away from her desk, heading down a long hallway toward the break room. This was my window. I had maybe 90 seconds before she returned. I stood up and wandered toward the frosted glass partition, pretending to admire the abstract corporate paintings hanging on the wall. The exact moment I stepped out of the receptionist's line of sight, the doddering old man vanished. My posture snapped straight. The limp disappeared. I moved with the silent, predatory speed of a man who used to raid cartel counting houses in the middle of the night. I slipped behind the assistant's desk and dropped to one knee. Her computer monitor was locked, but that did not matter to me. I did not need her password. From the deep pocket of my corduroy pants, I pulled out a custom-built military-grade flash drive. At the agency, we called them ghost drives. You plug it into a physical port, and it bypasses the operating system entirely. It clones the raw data directly from the hard drive in a matter of seconds, pulling everything. It takes the emails, the hidden ledgers, the deleted files, and the offshore routing numbers. I slid the drive into the USB port on the back of the computer tower. A tiny green light on the drive began to blink rapidly. It was pulling the data. I stayed low, keeping my eyes fixed on the hallway. The blinking sped up. It was a massive data dump. I heard the sharp click of high heels coming down the hallway. The assistant was returning. The green light turned solid. The clone was complete. I ripped the drive out of the port, dropped it back into my pocket, and instantly collapsed my posture back into a frail hunch. I stepped out from behind the desk just as the assistant walked into the area. "Oh, excuse me, miss," I said, holding up my hands defensively. "I was just looking for the restroom. This place is like a maze." Before the assistant could answer, the heavy oak doors of the main boardroom swung open. Preston walked out. He was flanked by 3 older, wealthy-looking white men wearing tailored suits. These were his investors. Preston was laughing loudly, exuding absolute confidence, selling them on whatever financial lie he had cooked up that morning. Then his eyes landed on me. The laugh died in his throat. His face flushed with a mixture of pure rage and absolute humiliation. For a man desperately trying to project the image of a flawless tech billionaire, the absolute last thing he wanted his investors to see was a doddering, poorly dressed black man holding a greasy paper bag in his immaculate lobby. "Victor, what the hell are you doing here?" he hissed, stepping away from the investors and marching directly toward me. His eyes were wide with fury. I held up the brown paper bag, making sure my hands shook visibly. "I brought you some lunch, Preston," I said, making my voice sound small and pathetic. "Maya said you were working so hard. I just wanted to make sure you were eating right." Preston snatched the bag out of my hands with so much force the paper tore. He did not even look inside. He tossed it directly into the nearest stainless steel trash can. He turned back to his investors, forcing a tight, humiliated smile. "Gentlemen, I am so deeply sorry," Preston said, gesturing toward me with pure disgust. "This is my fiancé's father. He gets a little confused sometimes. Dementia is a terrible thing to witness. Please give me one moment to handle this." He grabbed my bicep. His grip was vicious. His fingernails dug into my muscle through the fabric of my shirt. He dragged me toward the elevator banks, forcefully pulling me away from his audience. When the elevator doors opened, he shoved me inside and stepped in after me, keeping his finger pressed on the door close button. He leaned in close, his breath hot against my face. "What is wrong with you, you stupid old man?" he snarled. "Do you have any idea who those people are? They are venture capitalists. They hold the keys to my future. You do not show up here looking like a homeless beggar. You are an embarrassment to me, and you are an embarrassment to your daughter." I blinked repeatedly, letting my eyes water slightly. "I am sorry, Preston," I whispered. "I just wanted to help. I did not mean to interrupt your important meeting." "Save your pathetic apologies," he spat. The elevator reached the ground floor and the doors slid open. A massive security guard was standing by the reception desk. Preston snapped his fingers at the guard. "Escort this man out of my building," Preston ordered. "If he ever comes back, call the police and press charges for trespassing." The security guard grabbed my shoulder heavily and shoved me toward the glass exit doors. I kept my head down. I let myself look utterly defeated. I stumbled slightly as the guard literally pushed me out the front doors onto the concrete sidewalk. People walking past on their lunch breaks looked at me with pity. An old man thrown out onto the street like garbage. I stood on the sidewalk and slowly dusted off my corduroy pants. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. It was a forwarded message from Maya. Preston had just texted her from upstairs. "Keep your senile father away from my business. If he ever humiliates me in front of my board again, there will not be a wedding." I read the text and smiled. A genuine, cold, calculated smile. I reached into my pocket and felt the smooth metal of the ghost drive resting safely against my leg. Preston Sterling thought he had won. He thought he had publicly humiliated a weak, ignorant old fool. He thought he had kicked me out of his fortress and protected his secrets. But the truth was entirely different. The Trojan horse had already breached the gates. I walked out the front door carrying his entire financial life, his secrets, and his imminent destruction in the palm of my hand. I turned and walked toward my truck. The real hunt was just beginning. I drove back to my house in the quiet suburbs and parked my rusted truck in the garage. I walked down the creaky wooden stairs into my basement. To anyone else, it looked like the storage room of an elderly man who collected old fishing gear in dusty boxes. But behind a heavy steel cabinet lay my actual workspace. It was a secure, climate-controlled room outfitted with multiple monitors, independent satellite internet, and the processing power of a small federal field office. I sat down in my leather chair, plugged the ghost drive into my primary terminal, and started to work. Decryption is not magic. It is just math and patience. Preston was arrogant, which meant he was lazy. He used standard commercial encryption for his hidden folders. It took my software less than 40 minutes to crack the digital vault and lay his entire life bare across my screens. I opened the private ledgers. I already knew Preston was completely broke, but what I saw now was much worse than simple bankruptcy. He was bleeding cash to an entity listed as Apex Capital Solutions. I recognized the structure immediately. During my 4 decades at the agency, I had dismantled a dozen shell companies just like it. Apex Capital Solutions was not a legitimate financial institution. They were a shadow syndicate. They were loan sharks in custom-tailored suits who laundered money for cartels and charged extortionate interest rates to desperate businessmen. Preston owed them $5 million. The principal was due in exactly 3 weeks right after the wedding. But that was not the discovery that made my blood run cold. I opened the scanned loan agreement. I read the terms. Then I scrolled down to the signature page. There was Preston's signature, bold and sloppy. And right beneath it, listed as the sole financial guarantor of the $5 million debt, was my daughter's signature. My vision blurred with pure, unadulterated rage. I leaned closer to the monitor. The signature looked like Maya's, but it was forged. I knew my daughter's handwriting perfectly. Preston had copied her signature from a medical document and digitally transferred it to the loan agreement. He had legally bound her to a $5 million debt owned by ruthless criminals. If Preston defaulted, the syndicate would not break his legs. They would go after the guarantor. They would seize Maya's bank accounts, destroy her credit, and garnish her wages. When she tried to claim forgery, the syndicate would release documents implicating her in federal wire fraud. She would lose her medical license instantly. She would face federal prison. Preston was not marrying my daughter. He was taking her hostage. I printed the loan agreement, folded it into my jacket pocket, and picked up my phone. I texted Maya to meet me at a quiet 24-hour diner on the outskirts of town, a place where none of Preston's wealthy friends would ever go. I arrived early and sat in a booth in the back corner. The diner smelled like old coffee and fried food. Maya walked in 20 minutes later. She looked exhausted. The dark circles under her eyes were poorly concealed by makeup. The confident, brilliant trauma surgeon was gone. In her place was a terrified young woman carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. She slid into the booth across from me. She looked around nervously, terrified that Preston might have followed her. "Dad, you should not have called me," she whispered. "If Preston finds out I am here, he will be furious. He already thinks you are trying to ruin his business after what happened at his office today." I did not waste time with pleasantries. I reached into my jacket, pulled out the folded loan agreement, and slid it across the sticky table. "Look at the second page," I said softly. Maya picked up the paper. Her eyes scanned the document. When she reached the signature line, her hands began to shake violently. The paper rattled in her grip. A single tear fell onto the page, smudging the black ink. She dropped the document and covered her face with her hands. A quiet, broken sob escaped her lips. "He told you about the debt," I said. My voice was calm, offering her a safe place to land. She nodded, unable to speak for a moment. She took a ragged breath and wiped her eyes with a paper napkin. "He told me 2 months ago," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He said his company was having cash flow problems and he had taken a short-term loan to cover payroll. He said the lenders were dangerous people. Then he showed me that document. He told me he forged my signature to secure the funds because my credit was flawless and my medical license guaranteed future earnings." "Why did you not go to the police, Maya?" I asked gently. "Because he showed me the rest of the file," she cried. "He routed the loan money through joint accounts he set up in both our names. He used my personal laptop to send emails approving the transfers. He created a perfect digital trail that makes it look like I am the mastermind behind the fraud. Dad, he told me if I leave him, if I cancel the wedding, he will stop making the interest payments. The syndicate will come after me. He will hand all the forged evidence over to the federal prosecutors. I will lose my medical license. I will go to federal prison. I will lose everything I have ever worked for." She reached across the table and grabbed my hands. Her grip was desperate. "He told me if I just marry him and keep my mouth shut, he will secure a new round of legitimate investor funding after the wedding and pay off the syndicate," she said. "He told me I just have to play the part of the happy wife. I am trapped, Dad. I am so trapped, and I do not know what to do." I looked at my beautiful, brilliant daughter. She had spent her entire life helping people, saving lives in the operating room, and this arrogant parasite had turned her success into a weapon against her. I felt a cold, calculated calm wash over me. The father who wanted to comfort his little girl stepped back. The federal hunter stepped forward. "Maya, listen to me very carefully," I said, squeezing her hands firmly. "You are not going to prison. You are not going to lose your medical license. And you are absolutely not going to marry that man." "How?" she sobbed. "He holds all the cards. He has the debt. He holds nothing." I replied, my voice steady as a rock. "He thinks he is playing a game with a helpless woman and a senile old man. He does not know who I am, and he does not know what I can do. You are going to go back to him tonight. You are going to act like the perfect, compliant hostage. You are going to smile and pretend you are planning the wedding of your dreams. Can you do that for me?" She looked at me, searching my eyes. She must have seen the absolute certainty in my gaze because she took a deep breath and nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "I can do that." "Good," I said. "I will handle Preston. I will handle the syndicate. By the time I am done with him, he will wish he had never heard our family name." I walked Maya to her car, hugged her tightly, and watched her drive away. Then I drove back to my basement. I had a promise to keep, and I needed to lay the groundwork for my attack. The syndicate was the most immediate threat. I needed to know exactly how their financial network operated. I needed to see how fast they processed payments, which offshore routing nodes they used, and who the primary account holder was. To get that information, I had to interact with their system. I had to feed the beast. I opened my secure banking terminal. I accessed one of my oldest, most buried trust accounts in Zurich. It was an account completely disconnected from my real name, shielded by multiple layers of corporate anonymity. I set up a wire transfer using the payment routing numbers I had found on Preston's cloned hard drive. I could not send a small amount. A small amount would be processed automatically and ignored. I needed to trigger a manual review by the syndicate's accountants, so my tracing software could capture their internet protocol addresses. I typed in the transfer amount, $50,000. I tagged the payment with Preston's specific loan account number. I took a sip of black coffee and pressed execute. The funds vanished from my Zurich account and entered the global banking network. I watched my tracking software light up as the money bounced from Switzerland to the Cayman Islands and finally to a holding bank in the Bahamas. The syndicate received the money. My software successfully captured their internal routing data. I now had the exact coordinates of their financial heart. But the transfer had a secondary purpose. I knew how automated loan systems worked. When a massive unscheduled payment is applied to a high-risk loan, the system generates an automatic receipt. It sends a digital alert to the debtor to confirm the transaction. Across town in his luxurious penthouse apartment, Preston Sterling was likely sitting on his expensive leather sofa, drinking his scotch and feeling like the king of the world. He thought he had complete control over Maya. He thought he had successfully humiliated me and protected his secrets. Then his phone would vibrate. He would look down and see an email from Apex Capital Solutions. The email would thank him for the unscheduled principal payment of $50,000. Preston would freeze. He was completely broke. He knew he did not send that money. He knew his investors had not given him a dime. The only other person whose name was legally attached to that loan account was Maya. I smiled in the darkness of my basement. Preston was a paranoid, controlling narcissist. When a man like that sees $50,000 magically appear in a hidden criminal account, he does not feel relief. He feels terrified. He would instantly assume that Maya was hiding money from him. He would assume she had secret resources, secret allies, and a secret plan to escape his trap. The payment would shatter his illusion of total control. It would make him desperate, angry, and reckless. And a reckless man is a man who makes fatal mistakes. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the glowing monitors. I had spent my entire career dismantling men who thought their money made them untouchable. They always shared the same fatal flaw. They underestimated the quiet people. Preston believed he was a predator playing with helpless prey. He had no idea he had just walked blindly into a cage designed by a master architect. Let him panic. Let him wonder where the money came from. Let his paranoia eat away at his artificial confidence. The board was set. The pieces were moving. The countdown to his destruction had officially begun. I sat in my living room waiting. The grandfather clock ticked loudly in the silent house. It was a rhythmic, steady sound that matched the slow beating of my heart. I knew he was coming. When you corner a narcissist and threaten their sense of control, they do not retreat. They attack. Preston was a man who survived on the illusion of absolute dominance. The anonymous $50,000 payment to his syndicate loan had shattered that illusion. He believed my daughter Maya was hiding money from him. He believed she was planning an escape. And because he viewed me as a weak, helpless old man, he decided I was the easiest target to interrogate. I did not turn on the lights. I sat in my worn armchair, bathed in the pale moonlight filtering through the curtains. I took a slow, deep breath. In my days as a federal agent, I learned that the most dangerous moment in any operation is when the target panics. You have to let them exhaust their adrenaline. You have to let them feel like they are winning right up until the moment the cell door slams shut. The heavy thud of a car door slamming shattered the quiet neighborhood. Heavy footsteps stormed up my wooden porch. He did not knock. He did not ring the doorbell. A massive crash echoed through the house. The front door burst open, the wood splintering around the deadbolt. The door slammed violently against the interior wall, knocking a framed photograph of my late wife to the floor. The glass shattered. Preston stood in the doorway, breathing heavily. His expensive, custom-tailored suit was disheveled. His tie was loosened and his blonde hair was a mess. His face was twisted into a mask of pure, unhinged rage. He looked like a rabid animal stripped of his corporate charm and exposed for the violent thug he truly was. "Victor," he roared, his voice echoing in the dark hallway. "Where are you, you pathetic old fool?" I forced my hands to tremble. I let my shoulders slump and pulled my face into an expression of absolute terror. I slowly stood up from the armchair, letting my knees knock together. "Preston, what is going on?" I stammered, my voice shaking. "Why did you break my door?" He marched across the room and closed the distance between us in 3 long strides. He did not say a word before he acted. He reached out with both hands and grabbed the front of my shirt. He lifted me slightly off my feet and slammed me hard against the living room wall. The impact rattled my teeth. The drywall cracked behind my shoulders. My combat instincts flared. Every muscle in my body tensed, ready to drop my weight pivot and snap his knee. It would take less than 2 seconds to put him on the floor, screaming in agony. But I locked the predator back in its cage. I needed him to incriminate himself. I needed him to lay out his entire extortion plan while the hidden microphones in my living room recorded every single syllable. "Do not play dumb with me, Victor," he hissed, his face inches from mine. His breath smelled of expensive scotch and raw panic. "Where is the money?" "What money, Preston?" I cried out, letting a pathetic whine enter my voice. "I do not have any money. I live on a fixed pension. Please, you are hurting me." He slammed me against the wall again, harder this time. "You are lying," he spat, saliva flying from his lips. "Maya is hiding money from me, and I know she gave it to you. $50,000 just magically appeared in one of my private accounts today. A massive payment right out of thin air. She is trying to build a war chest to leave me, is she not? She thinks she can run. She thinks she can hide her assets in her poor daddy bank accounts." I blinked rapidly, squeezing a single tear out of the corner of my eye. "Preston, I swear to you I do not know what you are talking about. Maya has not given me a dime. She does not have $50,000. She is just a doctor working at the hospital. Please put me down." Preston dropped me. I collapsed onto the hardwood floor, landing hard on my hands and knees. I stayed there, playing the part of a defeated, broken old man. I looked up at him with wide, terrified eyes. He paced back and forth across my living room, running his hands through his hair. He was frantic. The syndicate payment had completely unraveled his nerves. He stopped and pointed a shaking finger at me. "Listen to me very carefully, you useless old man," Preston said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I own your daughter. I own her medical license. I own her freedom. If she tries to run, I will destroy her. I have a $5 million loan with people who make the mafia look like a charity. And my name is on the guarantee." I gasped, letting my jaw drop in simulated horror. "Preston, no. You forged her signature. That is a federal crime." He laughed, a cold, hollow sound that lacked any real humor. "Prove it," he mocked. I routed the funds through her computer. I set up the accounts. To the feds, it looks like she orchestrated the entire fraud. If I miss a payment, the syndicate will liquidate her assets. If she goes to the police, she goes to federal prison. She is mine, Victor, and now you are going to pay for her little rebellion." He crouched down, getting right in my face. He grabbed my chin, forcing me to look him in the eyes. "Since your daughter wants to play games with my money, you are going to cover my wedding expenses," he demanded. "I need collateral. I know you own this house free and clear. It is located in a gentrifying neighborhood. It is worth at least $400,000. "My house," I whimpered. "Preston, please, this is all I have. Vivian and I built this house. You cannot take my home." "I am not asking, Victor," he snarled, releasing my chin and standing up. "You are going to sign the deed of this house over to me. Tomorrow morning, you are going to transfer full ownership to my holding company as collateral. If you do not, I will trigger a default on the syndicate loan by tomorrow afternoon. The lenders will come for Maya, and after they take everything she has, the feds will arrest her for wire fraud. I will watch her burn." I curled into a ball on the floor, wrapping my arms around my head. I let out a loud, pathetic sob. "No, please do not hurt my little girl. I will do whatever you want. Please just leave Maya out of this." Preston stood over me, looking down with absolute disgust. The panic that had driven him into my house was slowly being replaced by his usual arrogant superiority. He thought he had won. He thought he had broken me completely and secured a free asset to leverage against his mounting debts. "I will send my assistant to pick you up at 9 in the morning," Preston dictated, smoothing his wrinkled suit jacket. "We will go to a notary. You will sign the deed over to me. If you try to warn Maya, if you try to call the police, or if you try to pull a fast one, I make the call, and your daughter's life is over." I nodded furiously, keeping my face buried in my arms. "I understand, Preston. I will sign the house over. Just promise me you will not default on the loan. Promise me Maya will be safe." He let out a short, cruel laugh. "As long as she smiles at the altar and you give me your house, she will be perfectly fine," he sneered. Preston turned and walked toward the ruined front door. He stepped over the shattered glass of my wife's photograph, his expensive leather shoes grinding the pieces into the hardwood floor. He walked out into the night, leaving the door hanging open on its broken hinges. I stayed on the floor, listening to his car engine roar to life. I waited until the sound of his tires squealing down the street faded into the distance. Then the trembling stopped. My breathing slowed. My heart rate returned to a resting calm. I stood up, dusting off my knees. I walked over to the broken picture frame and carefully picked up the photograph of Vivian. I brushed the dust off her smiling face and placed the picture gently on the mantel. Preston Sterling had just made the biggest mistake of his miserable life. He had confessed to wire fraud, extortion, and forgery directly into 5 hidden microphones that were hardwired to an encrypted server in my basement. But I was not going to hand that recording to the police. Not yet. Handing him over to the authorities would be too easy. It would not solve the problem of the syndicate, and it would not punish him enough. I walked down the dark hallway into my kitchen. I bypassed the standard telephone on the wall. I opened a false panel behind the pantry shelves and pulled out a satellite phone that operated on a closed, encrypted network. I punched in a 14-digit international number. The line clicked and hissed as the signal bounced off a satellite over the Atlantic Ocean. It rang twice before a crisp professional voice answered. "Good evening, Mr. Rollins," the voice said, speaking with a thick Swiss accent. "It is quite late in Atlanta. To what do I owe the pleasure?" "Good evening, Klaus," I replied, my voice sharp and authoritative, completely devoid of the pathetic old man routine I had just performed. "I have a situation that requires immediate liquidity." "Of course, Sir Klaus said. How much do you require?" "I need to mobilize $20 million from the primary trust I instructed. I need you to establish a new proxy corporation, a blind holding company registered in a non-extradition jurisdiction. Name it VR Holdings." "Understood, Mr. Rollins," Klaus said, typing rapidly on his end. "The funds can be liquidated and moved into the holding account by morning. What is the objective of this new entity?" I looked out the kitchen window, staring into the dark night. Preston thought he was taking my house. He thought he was the ultimate predator. He had no idea he was dealing with a man who could buy and sell his entire existence before breakfast. VR Holdings is going to execute a hostile debt acquisition, I said, my voice cold and calculated. There is a shadow syndicate operating out of the Bahamas under the name Apex Capital Solutions. They hold a $5 million note on a man named Preston Sterling. I want VR Holdings to purchase that debt in cash at a 20% premium. Klaus paused for a moment. Purchasing distressed debt from an unregulated syndicate is highly unusual, sir. They will demand absolute discretion. Offer them $1 million bonus for immediate transfer of the paper, I said. Criminals are predictable, Klaus. They will not ask questions if you flood them with cash. I want to own Preston Sterling debt by tomorrow afternoon. I want to be his sole creditor. It shall be done, Mr. Rollins, Klaus confirmed. Anything else? Yes, I added. Prepare a team of forensic accountants. Once we own the paper, I am going to bleed him dry. I hung up the satellite phone and slid it back into the hidden compartment. I walked back into the living room and stared at the broken front door. Preston wanted my house. I was going to give him a piece of paper tomorrow, but it would not save him, because while he was busy stealing a worthless deed, I was buying the chain around his neck. I was going to own him completely. He thought he was playing checkers with a senile old fool. He did not realize I was playing a global game of chess, and I had just trapped his king. The invitation arrived by courier the next morning. It was a thick, cream-colored envelope sealed with gold wax. Preston parents Richard and Patricia Sterling had flown into Atlanta for the wedding preparations. The note inside dictated that I was to join them for dinner at the Oak Ridge Country Club to discuss the financial arrangements for my daughter. It was not an invitation. It was a summons. I arrived at the country club at 7 in the evening. I wore the same faded gray suit I always wore. When I handed my keys to the valet, he looked at my rusted truck with absolute disdain. I walked up the marble steps to the main dining terrace. Richard and Patricia were already seated at a prime table overlooking the golf course. Richard was a large man with a red face and a custom-tailored suit that could not hide his expanding waistline. Patricia was thin and sharp with blonde hair pulled back tightly and diamonds glittering on her neck. They looked like the kind of people who inherited their wealth and spent their entire lives making sure everyone else felt inferior. I approached the table slowly, letting my shoulders slump. I shuffled my feet. Neither of them stood up to greet me. "Ah, Victor," Richard said, waving a hand dismissively. "You found the place. I was worried you might get lost. Sit down." I pulled out my own chair and sat. Patricia looked at my faded suit and wrinkled her nose as if a bad smell had just drifted across the table. We went ahead and ordered the wine, Patricia said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "It is a vintage Bordeaux. I am sure it is a bit robust for your palate, but you can just have water if you prefer." "Water is fine," I replied, keeping my voice soft and raspy. "Thank you for inviting me." Richard leaned forward, resting his elbows on the crisp white tablecloth. "Let us skip the pleasantries, Victor. We are here to talk about the wedding budget. Preston is spending a fortune to give your daughter the life she has always dreamed of. A life you could never provide for her on a civil service pension." I nodded slowly, looking down at my hands. "Maya is a very successful surgeon," I said quietly. "She works very hard." Patricia let out a short, mocking laugh. "Being a doctor is a nice little job, Victor, but let us be realistic. Preston is a tech visionary. He is rescuing her from a very modest background. We are opening doors for her that she could never open on her own. And frankly, we expect you to show some gratitude." I let my hands shake slightly on the table. "I am very grateful," I whispered. "Good," Richard said. "Because Preston tells me you have been acting a bit confused lately. He mentioned that you showed up at his corporate office looking disheveled and disoriented. We cannot have that kind of embarrassment at the wedding, Victor. Our business associates will be there." I blinked rapidly, pretending to look ashamed. "I just wanted to bring him lunch," I mumbled. Patricia sighed deeply and exchanged a knowing look with her husband. "Victor," she said, her tone shifting to one of fake maternal concern. "We know you are getting older. The mind starts to slip. It happens to people from your socioeconomic background. The stress of poverty ages the brain. We think you need help managing your affairs." Richard reached into his leather briefcase resting on the floor. He pulled out a thick stack of legal documents and dropped them onto the table right in front of me. The waiter arrived at that exact moment to pour their wine. Richard ignored the waiter, completely treating him like a piece of furniture. "Preston told me you agreed to sign over the deed to your house to help cover the wedding expenses," Richard said once the waiter left. "That is a good first step. But I had my corporate lawyers draw up something more comprehensive." I looked down at the documents. The top page was a property transfer deed. But the second page was what caught my eye. It was a petition for voluntary legal guardianship. "What is this?" I asked, letting my voice crack with simulated panic. "It is for your own good, Victor," Patricia said, taking a delicate sip of her wine. "You are living alone in a deteriorating neighborhood. You are clearly showing signs of dementia. Preston is going to step in and manage your pension and your assets. He will make sure your bills are paid so you do not end up on the street." I stared at the paperwork. The audacity of these people was almost impressive. Preston had not just demanded my house as collateral for his syndicate debt. He had gone to his parents and convinced them to help him steal my entire financial identity. They wanted to take my pension, my social security, and my independence. They wanted to strip me down to nothing and leave me completely at his mercy. And they were sitting here drinking $200 wine thinking they were doing me a favor. But I do not need a guardian. I whimpered, shrinking back in my chair. I can take care of myself. I know how to pay my bills. Please do not take my pension. Richard slammed his hand flat on the table, causing the silverware to rattle. "Listen to me, you stubborn old fool," he hissed, leaning closer so the other tables could not hear. "You have zero leverage here. Have zero. Preston holds your daughter's future in his hands. He can destroy her medical career tomorrow if he wants to. You are going to sign these papers, and you are going to sign them right now. If you do not, we will go to a judge, declare you mentally incompetent, and take everything anyway. This is the easy way." I looked at Patricia, hoping she might show a shred of human decency. She just smiled, a cold, predatory smile, and slid a gold-plated fountain pen across the table toward me. "Do the right thing, Victor," she purred. "For Maya." I picked up the pen. My hand trembled violently. I made sure to let the tip of the pen hover over the signature line for a long, agonizing moment. I looked at Richard with wide, terrified eyes. I let a tear form and slide down my wrinkled cheek. "You promise he will not hurt her," I whispered, begging like a broken man. Richard leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms, looking incredibly satisfied. "He will treat her exactly as she deserves," he replied. "Now sign the papers." I lowered the pen. With a slow, shaky hand, I signed my name on the property transfer deed. Then I turned the page and signed my name on the voluntary guardianship agreement. I pushed the stack of papers back across the table. Richard snatched them up instantly. He reviewed the signatures, checked the dates, and smiled a genuine, greedy smile. He slid the documents carefully into his leather briefcase and snapped the brass locks shut. Patricia picked up her wine glass. Richard picked up his. They clinked the crystal glasses together over the center of the table. "To the future of the Sterling family," Richard said, his eyes gleaming with triumph. "To securing our investments," Patricia added, taking a long, satisfied drink. They did not invite me to toast. They did not even look at me anymore. I had served my purpose. I was just an empty vessel they had successfully looted. "I think I will go home now," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I am very tired." "Yes, go home, Victor," Richard said dismissively, already looking at the dinner menu. "Make sure you pack your things. Preston will be putting the house on the market next week. We will find a nice, quiet nursing facility for you out in the country." I stood up slowly. I pushed my chair back and turned away from the table. I walked across the dining terrace, keeping my head down, and my shoulders slumped until I was out of their sight. When I reached the valet stand, I handed the young man my ticket. I stood in the cool night air and took a deep breath. The frail, terrified old man vanished into the darkness. I stood tall. My spine straightened. The tremor in my hands disappeared completely. A cold, hard smile spread across my face. Richard and Patricia Sterling thought they had just executed the perfect corporate theft. They thought they had bullied a helpless old man into handing over a $400,000 property and complete control of his life. They had no idea what they had actually just signed. 40 years of working for the federal government teaches you a few things about corporate liability. You learn how shell companies work. You learn how the rich use legal entities to shield themselves from toxic assets. And you learn how to reverse engineer those traps to catch the people who think they are untouchable. In 1998, I was working an investigation into a corrupt chemical manufacturing company. During that case, I learned about the devastating legal consequences of environmental hazards. Shortly after that case closed, I set up a blind trust. Through that trust, I created an anonymous limited liability company called Ironclad Properties. Ironclad Properties was a ghost. It had no public face, no active bank accounts, and no visible assets. Except for one. When I bought my house, I did not put the deed in my name. I placed it under Ironclad Properties. But that house was not just a piece of real estate. The land beneath it was part of an old industrial dumping ground. The original structure was filled with toxic lead paint and asbestos insulation. Over the years, I had safely mitigated the risks for my own living conditions, but I never formally filed the environmental remediation certificates with the federal government. By law, the registered owner of that property was personally liable for massive federal cleanup fines and environmental hazard penalties. Those fines accrued interest every single day they went unpaid. For 20 years, Ironclad Properties had been silently racking up millions of dollars in federal environmental liabilities. I was completely shielded from that debt because I did not legally exist on the company paperwork. But Richard Sterling just took it upon himself to absorb it. When I signed that property transfer deed, I did not give them a house. I executed a hostile liability transfer. The documents Richard arrogant lawyers drew up included a standard assumption of liability clause. It was designed to make sure I could not sue them later. Instead, it legally bound Richard, Patricia, and Preston to the accumulated debts of the property. They just inherited over $12 million in federal environmental fines. The Environmental Protection Agency is not a shadow syndicate. You cannot negotiate with them. You cannot hide from them. They freeze your assets, they seize your corporate holdings, and they dismantle your life until every single penny is paid. And the voluntary guardianship form they forced me to sign. That was the masterstroke. By establishing Preston as my legal financial guardian, they legally tied his personal corporate assets to my toxic shell company. When the federal government came to collect the fines, they would not stop at the house. They would go straight into Preston bank accounts, straight into Richard investment portfolios, and straight into Patricia trust funds. I watched the valet pull my rusty Ford truck up to the curb. I tipped him $20 and climbed into the driver's seat. I started the engine and drove away from the country club, leaving the Sterling family to enjoy their expensive wine. They thought they had trapped me. They thought they had conquered my family. But they had just legally strapped a $12 million federal bomb to their own chests. And I was holding the detonator. I merged onto the highway heading back to my basement. The syndicate was the next target. It was time to buy the rest of the chain around Preston neck. I sat in the glow of my multiple monitors down in the secure basement. The wedding was exactly 14 days away. Time was a rapidly shrinking window. I had successfully transferred the toxic environmental liability of my house to Preston and his arrogant parents. That legal trap was set and waiting for the federal government to spring it, but I could not afford to celebrate or rest. My daughter was still a hostage. Preston still held the forged loan documents. He still possessed the power to destroy her medical license and send her to federal prison if she did not comply with his demands. I needed to know exactly how he planned to handle the massive shadow syndicate once the wedding was over. A man $5 million in debt to organized crime does not just hope for the best. He has a concrete exit strategy. I needed to find it. I opened the decrypted data from the ghost drive I had pulled from his assistant computer. I bypassed his standard inbox and dug into the deleted, archived files. Criminals always think clicking delete actually erases their sins. They never understand that data leaves a permanent digital shadow on the hard drive. It took me 3 continuous hours of sifting through corporate garbage and useless marketing drafts to find the hidden communication thread. It was routed through an encrypted email server based in Malta. Preston had been exchanging highly secure messages with a high-risk insurance broker. This was a broker who specialized in expedited underwriting for ultra-wealthy clients who needed policies quickly and quietly. I opened the attached document labeled as finalized. The title of the file made my blood run ice cold. It was a comprehensive life insurance policy. The primary insured was my daughter, Maya Rollins. The sole beneficiary was Preston Sterling. The payout in the event of her untimely death was $10 million. I leaned closer to the screen, reading every single line of the dense legal text. Preston had initiated the policy 2 months ago, right after he forced Maya to sign the fraudulent loan guarantee. He had paid an astronomical premium in cash to bypass the standard medical waiting periods and psychological evaluations. The policy was fully active right now. It went into immediate legal effect the moment they signed the marriage certificate. But it was the specific riders attached to the policy that confirmed my absolute worst fears. Preston had paid extra for an accidental death and dismemberment multiplier. He had also specifically ensured that the policy covered international travel without any geographic restrictions. I opened his personal calendar application on my second monitor. I checked the detailed itinerary for their upcoming honeymoon. He had booked a remote private luxury villa on the cliffs of the Amalfi Coast in Italy. It was a place famous for its breathtaking views and its steep, dangerous rocky drops directly into the sea. The math clicked into place with horrifying precision. Preston was never going to secure legitimate funding. He was never going to build a real tech company. And he was never going to let my daughter live. His plan was brutally simple and completely evil. He would marry Maya to activate the $10 million insurance policy. He would take her to a remote cliffside in Italy. There would be a tragic accident, a sudden slip on the wet rocks, a fatal fall into the Mediterranean Sea. He would return home a grieving wealthy widower playing the victim for the cameras. He would use $5 million to pay off the shadow syndicate and clear his name. He would keep the remaining $5 million to fund his pathetic, lavish lifestyle and launch his next fraudulent venture. He was not just an extortionist manipulating a young woman. He was a premeditated murderer, and my daughter was his target. My hands gripped the edge of my heavy wooden desk so hard the wood groaned under the immense pressure. I have spent 40 years looking into the eyes of cartel bosses, hitmen, and white-collar sociopaths. I have seen the absolute worst of human nature up close. But discovering that a man intended to murder my only child for a financial payout shattered my professional detachment completely. A dark, violent rage exploded inside my chest. I wanted to stand up, walk to my old rusted truck drive straight to his luxury penthouse and beat him to death with my bare hands. I wanted to hear his bones snap. I wanted to watch the arrogance drain from his eyes as he realized he had crossed the wrong father. I stood up and paced the length of my concrete basement floor. I had to force myself to breathe deeply. I had to lock the violent, protective father away and bring the cold, calculating federal agent back to the surface. Physical violence would not save Maya. If I killed Preston tonight, I would go to prison for the rest of my life. But worse than that, killing him would trigger an automatic default on the $5 million syndicate loan tomorrow morning. The syndicate would instantly activate the guarantee. They would come after Maya with everything they had. They would seize her bank accounts and liquidate her assets. When the dust settled, the federal investigators would find the forged documents linking her to the massive wire fraud. The police could not help me either. If I walked into a precinct right now and handed them the cloned hard drive, they would arrest Preston for fraud and attempted insurance scams. But the legal machinery moves blindly and destructively. The moment the loan fraud became public record, Maya would be indicted as a co-conspirator because her signature was on the documents. Her medical license would be suspended immediately. She would face a decade of grueling legal battles just to clear her name. Even if she eventually proved her innocence, her career as a brilliant trauma surgeon would be permanently destroyed. The justice system is a blunt instrument. It does not care about context or hostage situations. It only cares about the signatures on the paper. I could not rely on the police. I could not rely on the courts. I had to dismantle Preston Sterling entirely outside the boundaries of the law. I had to strip him of every single resource he possessed so that he had absolutely no power left to pull the trigger. He needed the syndicate to exert pressure on Maya. He needed the illusion of wealth to maintain his control over her life. If I destroyed his financial foundation, the entire murder plot would collapse under its own weight. I sat back down in my leather chair. I looked at the $10 million insurance policy glowing ominously on the screen. Preston thought he had engineered the perfect, flawless crime. He thought he was holding all the winning cards in this game, but he did not realize that I was about to buy the entire casino out from under him. I picked up my secure satellite phone. I needed to finalize the hostile takeover of his debt immediately. I dialed Klaus, my private wealth manager in Zurich. The encrypted line connected instantly without a single ring. "Klaus," I said, my voice completely steady and stripped of all emotion. "What is the current status of VR Holdings and the syndicate acquisition?" Klaus replied in his crisp professional tone. "The $20 million has been fully cleared, Mr. Rollins. We have made direct contact with the primary principals of Apex Capital Solutions. As you predicted, they were highly receptive to a cash buyout of the Sterling note at a 20% premium. They are currently transferring the digital bearer bonds and all associated financial guarantees to our secure proxy servers. The transaction will be fully executed and legally binding within the next 12 hours. "Excellent," I said. "Make sure the transfer includes all original physical documents and the digital metadata of the forged signatures. I want everything they hold on him." I want the complete chain of custody for the loan. Klaus confirmed the details. Once this is complete, Mr. Rollins 5ER Holdings will be the sole legal owner of Preston Sterling debt. You will have absolute authority to call the loan to seize his assets or to force an immediate default. What are your specific instructions once the paper is secured? I stared at the picture of my daughter smiling brightly in her surgical scrubs pinned to the bulletin board above my desk. I thought about the cold, terrifying grip Preston had on the back of her neck at the engagement party. I thought about the jagged rocks at the bottom of the cliff in Italy. Once the debt is fully secured, Klaus, I want you to draft a formal aggressive demand for immediate repayment in full, I instructed. Send it directly to his personal executive email. Do not mention my name under any circumstances. Let him believe the syndicate simply sold his debt to a larger, more ruthless corporate predator. I want him to feel the walls closing in rapidly. I want him to know that his time is up and his leverage is gone. It will be done exactly as you ask, Mr. Rollins, Klaus said before disconnecting the secure line. I placed the phone down on the desk. The trap was moving from the quiet planning phase directly into hostile execution. Preston had built his entire miserable life on leverage. He used debt to control innocent people. He used fear to maintain his unearned power. He truly thought he could use my daughter's life to pay for his own arrogant mistakes. But the fundamental rule of leverage is that it only works if you are the one holding the lever. By tomorrow afternoon, I would officially own his debt. I would own his future. I would own him completely. I closed the insurance policy document on my screen and opened a new blank file. It was time to prepare for the final confrontation. I was not just going to stop a murder. I was going to erase Preston Sterling from the face of the earth. The digital clock on my basement server wall read 2 in the morning. The glowing red numbers marked the exact moment I shifted from defense to absolute offense. I could not simply pay off the $5 million debt Preston owed to Apex Capital Solutions. If you hand a shadow syndicate a massive bag of cash to settle an extorted loan, they do not just walk away. They smell desperation. They smell weakness. They realize the hostage is valuable, and they find a new way to bleed you dry. If I paid them off directly on behalf of my daughter, they would keep copies of the forged documents and hold them over her head for the rest of her life. You do not negotiate with wolves. You do not feed them hoping they will leave you alone. You have to become a much larger, much more terrifying predator and swallow them whole. I sat in my heavy leather chair and watched the encrypted connection establish itself across my 4 monitors. Klaus, my wealth manager in Zurich, was waiting on the secure line. I had authorized the release of $20 million from my primary hidden retirement fund. This was money I had aggressively accumulated over 4 decades of analyzing offshore tax havens, seizing illicit assets, and playing the global market with absolute precision. My late wife Vivian and I had lived a humble life because we knew that financial power is only effective when no one knows you have it. Tonight, that power was fully unchained, Klaus said, speaking clearly into the microphone. Give me the operational status of VR Holdings. The entity is fully established and insulated. Mr. Rollins Klaus replied, his voice crisp and clinical through the encrypted audio feed. VR Holdings is now a legally registered proxy corporation in a jurisdiction that does not honor international subpoenas. The $20 million has been cleared and washed through 3 separate institutional nodes. The funds are liquid, untraceable, and ready for immediate deployment. Initiate contact with the principals at Apex Capital Solutions, I instructed. You are acting as the Senior Acquisition Director for VR Holdings. You are not asking for a favor. You are executing a hostile buyout of distressed debt. You will offer them $6 million in untraceable digital currency for the immediate and total transfer of Preston Sterling loan portfolio. That is the $5 million principal plus a $1 million cash premium for their trouble. $6 million is a highly aggressive premium, Mr. Rollins Klaus noted. They will undoubtedly accept, but they might attempt to retain digital copies of the forged guarantee documents for future leverage. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the heavy oak desk. That is exactly why you are going to lay out the terms with absolute brutality, I said. You tell them that VR Holdings is a multinational acquisition firm that does not tolerate loose ends. You tell them that if a single byte of data regarding Preston Sterling or Maya Rollins remains on their servers after the transaction, VR Holdings will consider it an act of corporate theft. You hint that we know exactly how they launder their money through the Cayman Islands. You make them understand that taking the $6 million is the smartest, safest decision they will ever make, and crossing us would mean their absolute destruction. Understood perfectly, Mr. Rollins, Klaus said. I am opening the dark web communication channels with their financial brokers right now. I will keep the audio feed live so you can monitor the transaction protocol. I sat back and listened to the silence on the line. For the next 20 minutes, I watched the global tracking software on my left monitor. I was hunting a ghost syndicate, and I was doing it from a basement in the suburbs of Atlanta. I listened to the faint clicking of Klaus typing on his keyboard thousands of miles away. Then the transaction window opened on my primary screen. Apex Capital Solutions had taken the bait. Criminals are entirely predictable when you remove their ego and replace it with overwhelming financial incentive. A shadow syndicate does not care about Preston Sterling. They do not care about his fake tech company or his arrogant attitude. They only care about the return on their investment. A $1 million net profit generated in a single night without having to break a single bone or file a single lawsuit is a perfect victory for a loan shark. Klaus spoke through the feed. Mr. Rollins, they have accepted the terms. They are terrified of the institutional weight VR Holdings projects. They are preparing the digital transfer of the bearer bonds, the original loan agreement, and the metadata containing the forged signatures. Do not release the escrow funds until our servers verify the integrity of the data I ordered. I want to see the forged signature file securely on my network before they get a single dime. The progress bar appeared on my center monitor. It was a visual representation of my daughter Freedom downloading into my secure vault. 10%, 30%, 60%. My heart beat with a slow, steady rhythm. I watched the encrypted packets flow through the international proxy servers. 90%, 100%. Transfer complete, Klaus announced. The files are securely locked in your local drive. The escrow funds have been released to Apex Capital Solutions. They have formally relinquished all claims to the debt. They have scrubbed their ledgers. The syndicate is officially out of the picture. I opened the digital vault on my computer. I opened the loan agreement. I scrolled past the complex financial jargon and went straight to the final page. I looked at the digital copy of the signature. Maya Rollins. It was the forged signature that had kept my daughter awake at night, the signature that Preston used to hold her hostage. I exhaled a long, slow breath. The crushing weight that had been sitting on my chest since the engagement party finally lifted. The shadow syndicate could no longer threaten my little girl. They could no longer touch her medical license. They could no longer send their thugs to intimidate her. The criminal element of this equation had been completely surgically removed. But Maya was not free, because the debt had not been erased. It had simply changed hands. Preston Sterling still owed $5 million. He was still legally bound to the loan. But his creditor was no longer a faceless criminal organization in the Bahamas. His creditor was the old black man he had humiliated in his corporate lobby. His creditor was the man he had shoved against a wall and threatened. His creditor was me. Now it was time to let him know that the rules of the game had changed. Klaus, I said, my voice dropping to a cold, mechanical whisper. The acquisition is verified. VR Holdings is now the sole legal owner of Preston Sterling debt. It is time to go on the offensive. I am ready, Mr. Rollins, Klaus replied. How do you wish to proceed? Draft a formal corporate demand letter, I instructed. Send it directly to Preston personal encrypted email address, the one he thinks no one else knows about. Use the VR Holdings corporate letterhead. Keep the language absolutely ruthless. What are the specific terms of the demand, Klaus asked. Inform Mr. Sterling that Apex Capital Solutions has been aggressively bought out by VR Holdings, I said. Inform him that all of his outstanding debts, liabilities, and guarantees are now the exclusive property of our firm. Tell him that as the new debt holders, we have conducted a comprehensive risk assessment of his tech company. State clearly that we have found his company to be functionally insolvent and his collateral to be completely fraudulent. I watched the cursor blink on my screen, visualizing the absolute terror Preston would feel when he read those words. Therefore, I continued, VR Holdings is calling the loan. Demand an immediate good faith payment of $1 million by close of business tomorrow. Tell him that if the funds are not wired to our account by 5 p.m, we will trigger a catastrophic default. We will freeze his corporate accounts, we will seize his personal assets, and we will initiate federal fraud charges regarding the forged guarantor signatures. That is a remarkably aggressive timeline, Mr. Rollins, Klaus noted. He does not have $1 million in liquidity. It is mathematically impossible for him to meet that demand. I know it is impossible, Klaus. I said, a dark smile forming on my face. That is the entire point. I want him to realize he is trapped. I want him to look at his empty bank accounts and feel the exact same suffocating panic he forced my daughter to feel. I want him to run out of options. Send the email immediately. The email was sent. I leaned back in my leather chair and stared at the ceiling of my basement. Preston Sterling was a man who believed he could control the world through manipulation and fear. He thought he was the smartest person in any room. He thought he had outsmarted a shadow syndicate. He thought he had trapped a brilliant surgeon, and he thought he had bullied a weak old man into surrendering his home. He was about to wake up to a reality where none of those things were true. He was about to discover that a massive, faceless corporate entity had just swallowed his life whole. He would assume VR Holdings was a ruthless hedge fund or a hostile private equity firm. He would assume he was dealing with billionaires in glass towers who crushed people like him for sport. He would never in a million years suspect that VR Holdings was simply the initials of Victor Rollins. He would never guess that the architect of his total destruction was sitting in a dusty basement wearing a faded gray suit and drinking black coffee. The hostile takeover was complete. I now owned his debt. I owned his secrets. I owned his life insurance policy. I had surrounded him completely, and he did not even know the walls were there. The trap was armed, and the bait was set. All I had to do now was wait for the sun to rise and watch him tear himself apart, trying to escape. I sat in the glow of my monitors as the morning sun crept through the narrow window of my basement. The trap was set, and the email from VR Holdings was waiting in Preston Sterling private inbox. At exactly 7 in the morning, I watched the digital tracker on my screen indicate that the email had been opened. I immediately activated the remote access protocol on Preston's cellular phone, turning his microphone into a live audio feed. I put on my headphones and listened to the sound of his pristine world shattering. At first, there was only the sound of him breathing. It was slow and rhythmic. Then I heard the sharp click of his computer mouse as he scrolled through the formal demand letter. The breathing stopped. It was replaced by a sudden sharp gasp. I heard the sound of a heavy glass tumbler shattering against a wall. He started cursing violently, pacing across the hardwood floors of his luxury penthouse. Preston was reading the absolute destruction of his life. The letter stated clearly that Apex Capital Solutions had been acquired. VR Holdings was the new owner of his $5 million debt. And because of the extreme high-risk nature of his fraudulent tech company, VR Holdings was calling the loan. The demand was absolute. $1 million in liquid cash wired to our offshore account by close of business today. Failure to comply would result in immediate asset seizure and the release of his forged documents to federal prosecutors. I listened to him panic. He was a man who survived entirely on projecting power, and now he was suffocating under the weight of a predator he could not even see. I heard him frantically dial his phone. He called his father, Richard. "Dad, you have to help me," Preston stammered, his voice stripped of all its usual arrogance. "The syndicate sold my debt. A new firm bought the paper, and they want $1 million today. They know about the forged signatures, Dad. They know everything." I heard Richard sigh on the other end of the line. His voice was laced with irritation. "Calm down, Preston. You are acting like a child. You do not need to panic. We secured the collateral last night. We have the house. We have the legal guardianship. You control that old man and everything he owns." "But I need $1 million in cash today," Preston cried. "Then take the deed to the bank," Richard snapped. "Take the property transfer and the guardianship papers to your loan officer at Atlanta First National. Leverage the property for an emergency commercial line of credit. The house is worth $400,000. With the business accounts acting as a buffer, they will authorize a short-term bridge loan to cover your margin call. Stop whining and go execute the transaction." Richard hung up. I smiled in the dark. The sheer arrogance of the Sterling family was their ultimate vulnerability. They truly believed that stealing an asset from an elderly black man was their divine right, and they assumed the banking system would simply bend to their will. I watched the global positioning system tracker on my monitor as Preston's phone moved rapidly across the city. He was driving his expensive sports car straight to the financial district. He was desperate, and a desperate man does not read the fine print. I accessed the public wireless network of Atlanta First National Bank. Using a simple packet sniffer, I piggybacked onto their internal security cameras. I found the camera positioned in the executive loan department. I watched Preston walk into the office. His suit was wrinkled, he was sweating. He bypassed the reception desk and barged directly into the office of a senior loan officer. I listened through his phone microphone as he sat down in the leather chair. "Sarah, I need an immediate bridge loan," Preston demanded, his voice tight and breathless. $1 million. I have full collateral. I need the funds cleared and wired to an international account by 4 this afternoon. I watched the loan officer on the camera feed. She was a sharp professional woman. She looked at Preston with a mixture of annoyance and concern. "Preston, you know, we cannot originate a $1 million commercial loan in 6 hours," Sarah said calmly. "Your company accounts are completely overdrawn. We have been sending you margin warnings for weeks. I am bringing you a clean asset," Preston insisted, slamming his leather briefcase onto her mahogany desk. He snapped the locks open and pulled out the paperwork he had stolen from me the night before. "I have the deed to a prime piece of real estate in a gentrifying residential zone. $400,000 in equity owned free and clear. I also have a signed legal guardianship agreement giving me total control over the previous owner. Process the deed and authorize the credit line against the property." Sarah picked up the documents. She adjusted her glasses and looked at the property transfer deed. She began typing the address into her banking terminal. I leaned forward in my basement chair. This was the exact moment the blade would drop. I watched Sarah stop typing. She frowned. She clicked her mouse, opening a secondary verification window. She read the screen and then she looked back up at Preston. Her professional demeanor shifted into something incredibly cold. "Preston, where did you get this document?" Sarah asked, her voice dropping an octave. "I told you," Preston snapped. "My future father-in-law signed it over to me last night to cover wedding expenses. He is senile. I am his legal guardian now. Just process the transfer." Sarah pushed the papers back across the desk, sliding them away from her as if they were physically contaminated. "I cannot process this, Preston," she said firmly. "And frankly, you should pray that no one else ever processes it either." "What are you talking about?" Preston demanded, his face turning red with frustration. "This property transfer is completely invalid," Sarah explained. "Victor Rollins does not own this house. He has not owned this house for over 20 years. The property is legally registered to a limited liability company called Ironclad Properties, and Ironclad Properties is wholly owned by a protected federal trust established in 1998. Victor Rollins had absolutely no legal authority to sign this deed over to you personally." Preston froze. I heard his breath catch in his throat. "What do you mean he does not own it?" I watched him sign it. "He signed a piece of paper that means nothing," Sarah said. "But that is not the real problem, Preston. I just pulled the municipal title history on Ironclad Properties. There is a massive red flag on this asset. The land sits on an unmitigated toxic waste site. There are active federal environmental liens attached to this property for lead and asbestos remediation. The accumulated federal fines exceed $12 million. I watched Preston face drain of all color on the security camera. He looked like he had been physically struck. Sarah leaned forward, folding her hands on her desk. "By presenting this transfer deed and claiming legal guardianship over the entity associated with this house, you are attempting to legally attach yourself and your corporate holdings to a $12 million federal liability. If I scan this into our system, the Environmental Protection Agency will freeze every single bank account you have by tomorrow morning." "No," Preston whispered, his voice cracking. "No, that is impossible. He is just a stupid old man. He does not know anything about federal trusts or environmental liens." "He clearly knows more than you do, Preston," Sarah said, her tone devoid of any sympathy. "I am denying this loan application. Furthermore, due to the highly irregular nature of these documents and the massive negative liquidity of your tech company, I am formally placing a hold on your business accounts pending a fraud review. Please take your paperwork and leave my office." Preston stood up. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely gather the papers back into his briefcase. He stumbled out of the office and walked blindly through the bank lobby. I tracked him on the camera as he pushed through the revolving glass doors and stepped out into the brutal Atlanta heat. He stood on the concrete sidewalk, gripping his briefcase. I listened to him breathing heavily through the open microphone. I could hear the gears turning in his head. The panic was morphing into something else. It was morphing into absolute realization. He thought about the $50,000 anonymous payment to the syndicate. He thought about the sudden aggressive buyout of his debt by a ghost corporation. He thought about the flawless legal trap hidden inside the house deed he had so greedily stolen. He thought about the name of the company that now owned his life, VR Holdings. VR Holdings, Victor Rollins. I heard a low, guttural sound escape his throat. It was not a scream. It was the sound of an arrogant man realizing he had been completely, fundamentally destroyed by the person he perceived to be his weakest victim. The old black man in the faded suit had not just outsmarted him. He had orchestrated a financial execution with terrifying precision. Preston walked to his car. He slammed the door shut. He started the engine, and I heard the tires scream against the asphalt as he accelerated recklessly into the street. I checked the global positioning system tracker on his phone. He was not driving back to his corporate office. He was not driving to his penthouse. The red dot on the digital map was moving at 80 miles an hour, taking the fastest possible route directly toward my neighborhood. He was coming to my house. He had no money left. He had no leverage left. He had no legal options, and the syndicate debt was going to crush him by 5 o'clock. His entire world had been reduced to ashes in a single morning, and he knew exactly who lit the match. The psychological profile of a cornered narcissist is highly predictable. When you take away their money and their power, they revert to primal violence. He was coming to hurt me. He wanted to physically force me to undo what I had done. I took off my headphones. I shut down the monitors in my basement vault, leaving only the tracking screen active. I walked up the wooden stairs into my living room. I moved the broken glass of my wife picture frame into the corner. I stood in the center of the room waiting for the storm to arrive. I was an old man, but I was not weak. I had spent my entire life taking down dangerous men. Preston Sterling thought he was going to walk in here and brutalize a helpless victim. He was about to learn that when you walk into the lion den, you do not get to dictate the terms of the fight. The escalation was over. The physical confrontation was imminent. I cracked my knuckles, rolled my shoulders, and waited for the sound of his engine. I stood in the center of my living room waiting for the storm to make landfall. The tracking software on my hidden monitor downstairs had shown his red digital dot blazing a trail straight to my front porch. I knew my daughter Maya was ending her surgical shift at the hospital. I had sent her a simple text message an hour ago, telling her to come by the house because I had found some old photo albums for the wedding. I timed her commute perfectly. She would be walking through the front door in exactly 12 minutes. Preston was going to arrive in 2. The squeal of tires violently braking shattered the quiet suburban morning. A car door slammed with enough force to echo down the street. Heavy, furious footsteps pounded up the wooden steps of my porch. He did not bother knocking. He pushed through the front door that was already severely damaged from his visit the night before. The wood splintered loudly as the door banged against the interior wall. Preston Sterling stood in the entryway breathing like a cornered animal. His expensive tailored suit was wrinkled and drenched in sweat. His eyes were completely unhinged. He looked at me standing there in my faded gray suit, and the realization of his absolute defeat radiated from his trembling hands. "You did this," he screamed, his voice breaking with sheer panic and uncontrollable rage. VR Holdings, Victor Rollins. You set me up, you senile old freak. You bought my debt. You poisoned the property deed. You froze my bank accounts. I kept my hands perfectly still at my sides. I let my shoulders slump forward. I widened my eyes, simulating the terror of a confused elderly man who did not understand why a young man was yelling at him. "Preston, I do not know what you are talking about," I whimpered softly. "I gave you the house just like you asked. Please do not be angry with me. Do not play stupid with me." Preston roared, stepping closer. "You bought the syndicate paper. You own my loan. You are trying to ruin my life. You are going to fix this right now. You are going to sign a release for the debt, and you are going to give me the real deed to this house, or I swear I will tear you apart." He was 15 feet away, then 10 feet away, then 5 feet away. In my prime, working as a criminal investigator for the federal government, I would have dropped him before he took his third step. I knew exactly how to disarm him, how to break his collarbone, and how to pin him to the floor until the police arrived. But I needed him to commit a violent felony in front of a highly reliable witness. I needed him to cross the ultimate line so that his destruction would be absolute and legally binding. I looked at the grandfather clock in the corner of the room. Maya would be here in less than 2 minutes. I looked up at Preston and let the helpless mask slip for just a fraction of a second. I gave him a cold, knowing smile. "You do not have any leverage left, Preston," I whispered, clearly dropping the frail act entirely. "You are bankrupt, you are a fraud, and you are going to lose everything." That was the spark that ignited the powder keg. His mind completely snapped under the weight of his own failure. Preston lunged forward and swung his right fist. I saw the punch coming a mile away. I could have easily slipped under it and countered, but I stood my ground. I turned my jaw just enough to absorb the impact without breaking my neck or losing consciousness. His fist connected heavily with the side of my face. The force of the blow was fueled by pure desperation and absolute terror. Pain exploded across my cheekbone. The metallic taste of blood instantly filled my mouth as my lips split open against my teeth. I let my body go limp and I collapsed backward onto the hardwood floor. I hit the ground hard. My shoulder absorbed the brunt of the fall, but the impact still rattled my spine. Preston did not stop. He was completely consumed by his violent rage. He dropped to his knees, straddling my chest. He grabbed the lapels of my faded suit jacket and slammed my back against the floorboards. "Where are the documents?" He screamed, spitting saliva into my face. "Where is the release form? I will kill you. I will beat you to death right here, and I will tell the paramedics your weak heart finally gave out." He brought his hands up to my throat, his thick fingers wrapped tightly around my windpipe. He squeezed with all of his strength. I focused my mind, pushing past the primal human instinct to fight back and survive. I controlled my oxygen intake carefully. I let my eyes widen in simulated panic. I brought my hands up and feebly clawed at his wrists, playing the role of the helpless victim perfectly. He squeezed harder, cutting off my airway entirely. Dark spots began to dance in the corners of my vision. I counted the seconds in my head. 1, 2, 3, 4. The sound of the front door opening was soft, but it echoed like a gunshot in the tense, violent silence of the living room. "Dad, I am here," Maya called out cheerfully as she stepped into the entryway. She stopped dead in her tracks. Her heavy medical bag dropped from her shoulder and hit the floor with a loud thud. She looked at the scene unfolding in front of her. Her 72-year-old father, bleeding from the mouth, pinned to the hardwood floor, being choked to death by her wealthy fiancé. "Get off of him," she screamed. It was a raw, visceral sound of pure, absolute terror. She sprinted across the room and shoved Preston with all of her strength, pushing him in the shoulder. Preston let go of my throat instantly. He scrambled backwards, stumbling over his own feet as he rushed to stand up. The sudden interruption jolted him out of his violent trance and threw him right back into his manipulative survival mode. I coughed violently and gasped for air, rolling onto my side and clutching my chest. Maya dropped to her knees beside me, her hands hovering over my bleeding face, checking my pulse and my airway. "Oh my God, Dad, are you okay?" Maya cried, examining my jaw with her gentle surgeon hands. "What happened here? Why did you do this, Preston?" "I did not do anything." "Maya," Preston stammered, backing away toward the wall and holding his hands up defensively. "He attacked me. I came over here to check on him because he was acting crazy yesterday at the country club. I walked through the door and he just snapped. He started screaming about people stealing his house and ruining his life. He grabbed a heavy book and swung it at my head. I had to restrain him. I was just trying to calm him down." "He has lost his mind, Maya. The dementia has completely taken over his brain." I coughed, spitting a small amount of blood onto the floorboards. I looked at Maya with wide, terrified eyes. "He hit me," I whispered hoarsely, letting my voice shake. "He just walked in and hit me for no reason." Maya glared at Preston with absolute hatred burning in her eyes. "I am calling the police," she said, reaching for her phone in her pocket. "I already called them." Preston lied smoothly, pulling his own phone from his pocket and dialing 911. He put the phone to his ear and shifted his face into an expression of desperate panic. "Yes, hello, I need police immediately," he said into the receiver. "My future father-in-law is having a violent psychotic episode. He attacked me unprovoked. I had to restrain him, but he is hurting himself. Please hurry to the address." He hung up the phone and looked down at me. His eyes were cold and dead. He knew I had set him up. He knew Maya had seen everything. But he also knew that the criminal justice system is deeply biased toward wealthy, well-dressed white men and highly suspicious of black men regardless of their age or their innocence. He was going to use the system to lock me away and silence me. The police arrived in less than 5 minutes. 2 patrol officers walked through the broken front door with their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. Preston immediately went to work. He straightened his expensive suit. He lowered his voice, playing the calm, rational victim who had just survived a terrible ordeal. "Officers, thank God you are here," Preston said, stepping forward with a relieved sigh. "He is on the floor. He is deeply confused and violent. I think he forgot who I am. He attacked me unprovoked, and I had to put him on the ground to stop him from hurting us. The officers looked at the scene. They saw a wealthy corporate executive pointing at an old black man lying on the floor in a torn and faded suit. They saw my bleeding lip and my disheveled appearance. Maya tried to intervene immediately. "Officers, he is lying," my daughter pleaded, standing up and stepping between me and the police. "My father is not violent. This man attacked him. I walked in and saw him choking my father on the floor." Please step back," the older officer said, putting a hand up to silence her. He turned his attention back to Preston. "Sir, do you want to press charges for the assault today?" "Yes," Preston said, looking directly into my eyes. "I have to protect my fiancé from this madness. He is a clear danger to himself and others. I want him arrested and held for a mandatory psychiatric evaluation." The officers approached me cautiously. I did not resist. I slowly stood up, wiping the blood from my chin with the back of my hand. I let them turn me around and place the cold steel handcuffs around my wrists. The metal bit sharply into my skin. I kept my head down, playing the broken, defeated old man perfectly. Maya was crying hysterically, begging the officers to stop and listen to her, but they ignored her completely. As the officers escorted me toward the door, Preston stepped into my path. He leaned in close, pretending to check on my injuries so the officers would not suspect anything. The police gave him a brief moment of space. Preston lowered his mouth to my ear so no one else could hear him. "You think you are smart, old man?" Preston whispered, his voice dripping with venom and hatred. "But you just put yourself in a cage. You are going to rot in a holding cell tonight. And while you are locked up, I am going to have a little chat with Maya about her medical license and her federal fraud charges." Preston turned away from me and walked over to Maya, who was weeping near the armchair. He wrapped his arms around her in a fake, comforting embrace. The officers thought he was being a supportive, loving partner. But I watched his lips move as he whispered directly into her ear. The room was quiet enough that I heard the exact words he used to seal his own fate. "Marry me or he dies in prison," Preston whispered to my daughter. "Marry me tomorrow or I will press maximum felony charges. I will tell the judge he tried to murder me with a weapon, and then I will hand your forged signature over to the federal prosecutors. You choose, Maya. You choose right now." Maya froze completely. The tears stopped falling from her eyes. Her expression went completely hollow as the impossible, crushing weight of his extortion broke her spirit. She looked at me being led out the door by the police. She did not say a word to defend me anymore. She just nodded her head in absolute terrified defeat. I spent the night in a cold concrete holding cell at the county police precinct. The walls were painted a depressing shade of gray. The fluorescent lights buzzed endlessly overhead, making it impossible to sleep. My jaw throbbed with a dull, steady ache from the punch. My wrists were bruised from the tight metal cuffs. The other men in the holding cell left me alone. They saw an old man in a torn suit and assumed I was just another sad, forgotten story of the streets. I sat on the hard metal bench and stared at the heavy iron bars in front of me. Preston thought he had won again. He thought he had outmaneuvered me by utilizing the police as his personal security force. He thought throwing me in a cage gave him the ultimate undeniable leverage over my daughter. He thought the wedding was secure and his massive syndicate debt would soon be paid with her life insurance money. But he did not realize that I needed him to press charges. I needed him to commit perjury on a federal police report. I needed him to establish a documented legal record of his own lies under oath. By having me arrested, he had officially brought the criminal justice system into our private war. He had opened the door for federal discovery. He had handed me the absolute legal authority to destroy him in open court. He told Maya I would die in prison. He did not know that by tomorrow morning I would be walking out of this cell, and I would be bringing the entire devastating weight of the United States government crashing down on his head. I sat in the silence of the county holding cell as the morning light crept through the tiny barred window. My muscles ached from sleeping on a solid steel bench, and my jaw throbbed with a dull, rhythmic pain where Preston had struck me. But my mind was absolutely clear. I calculated the exact timeline. The wedding was exactly 48 hours away. A heavy iron door clanged open at the end of the cell block. Heavy footsteps echoed down the corridor, stopping directly in front of my cell. The guard tapped his baton against the bars. "Rollins, you are out," the guard grunted, turning the heavy key in the lock. "Your bail posted. Let us go." I stood up slowly, leaning heavily on the concrete wall to play up my physical exhaustion. I shuffled down the hallway to the processing desk where the duty sergeant handed me a plastic bag containing my wallet. my keys and my phone. I signed the release paperwork with a trembling hand. When I turned around, I saw exactly who had come to collect me. Standing in the brightly lit lobby of the precinct was Robert Miller. He was a tall, imposing black man with silver hair wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit. To the police officers in the room, he looked like a high-priced defense attorney. To me, he was the former regional director of the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. He was the man who had authorized my most dangerous undercover operations for 20 years. Robert did not say a word inside the precinct. He simply turned and walked out the double-glass doors. I followed him out into the humid Atlanta morning. We walked to his black luxury sedan parked at the curb. We got inside and the heavy doors closed, shutting out the noise of the city. "You look like hell," Victor, Robert said, gripping the steering wheel. He did not start the engine. He just stared at my bruised jaw and split lip. "I look exactly how I need to look, Robert," I replied, my voice dropping its frail tremor and returning to its natural commanding baritone. "Thank you for posting the bail so quickly. I could not use my own accounts without tipping my hand." Robert shook his head. "When I saw the arrest report cross my desk, I knew you were running an off-the-books operation. A man who dismantled the Chicago mob does not get taken down in a suburban living room by a software bro unless he wants to be arrested. What is the play here, Victor? You are playing a very dangerous game with local law enforcement." "It is not a game, Robert," I said, staring out the tinted window. "This man forged my daughter's signature on a $5 million shadow syndicate loan. He took out a $10 million life insurance policy on her, and he plans to push her off a cliff in Italy next week. He thinks he has backed us into a corner. He thinks sending me to jail guarantees Maya will walk down the aisle." Robert gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles turning gray. "Do you need a federal strike team, Victor? I can have a tactical unit at his penthouse in 10 minutes. "No," I said sharply. "If you arrest him now, the syndicate loan defaults. The automated systems will ruin Maya before the lawyers can sort out the forgery. I own his debt now, but I need him to execute his final offshore transfers, so I can legally attach the federal wire fraud directly to his father holding company. I need 48 hours, Robert. Let me finish the hunt." Robert looked at me for a long moment. He knew my methods. He knew I never missed. He unlocked the car doors. 48 hours, Victor, Robert said. "Do what you have to do." I stepped out of his car and walked the 2 miles back to my house. The neighborhood was quiet. My broken front door was temporarily boarded up by the police. I went inside, walked straight past the dried blood on the hardwood floor, and went down into my basement. The digital clock read 9 in the morning. The wedding was on Saturday. Preston was currently riding the adrenaline high of absolute victory. He believed he had neutralized the syndicate by securing my house. He believed he had neutralized me by having me arrested, and he believed he had completely broken Maya. But a narcissist who feels victorious is still a dangerous animal. He was still panicked about the anonymous firm VR Holdings calling his debt. I needed to extinguish that panic. I needed to feed his massive ego until he was so blinded by his own perceived brilliance that he ignored the trap closing around his ankles. I needed to give him a complete and total surrender. I picked up my secure phone and dialed Preston's cellular number. I activated a vocal modulation technique I had perfected over decades of undercover work. I constricted my vocal cords, shallowed my breathing, and brought tears to my eyes to naturally crack my voice. The phone rang 3 times before he answered. "Who is this?" Preston snapped, his voice laced with aggressive irritation. "Preston, please, it is Victor," I whimpered, letting a pathetic sob escape my lips. "Please do not hang up on me." There was a long, agonizing silence on the line. Then I heard him let out a slow, cruel chuckle. "Well, well, well," Preston sneered. "How was your night in the cage, old man? Did you enjoy the concrete bed? I told you I would break you. I told you I hold all the cards." "You did, Preston, you did," I cried, forcing my breathing to sound ragged and desperate. "I am so sorry. I do not know what came over me yesterday. My mind gets so confused lately. I was just so scared of losing my house. But spending the night in that cell terrified me. I cannot go back to prison, Preston. I am too old. Please, I am begging you, do not press the felony charges." I listened to the sound of him walking across his hardwood floor. He was pacing, but this time it was not out of panic. It was a victory march. He was soaking in every single drop of my simulated misery. "Why should I drop the charges?" Victor Preston asked, his voice dripping with absolute contempt. "You attacked me. You tried to ruin my reputation. You are a dangerous, senile liability. I will do whatever you want, I pleaded, letting my voice crack into a high-pitched whine. I signed the house over to you. I signed the guardianship papers. You have everything you wanted. Please just let me see my daughter get married. I promise I will not cause any trouble. I will sit quietly in the back row of the church. I will not speak to your guests. I will not even go to the reception. Just let me watch my little girl walk down the aisle. Preston laughed loudly this time. It was the sound of a predator playing with a wounded mouse. You will sit in the very last row. Preston dictated, his tone absolute and commanding. You will wear a clean suit so you do not embarrass me. You will not speak to Maya. You will not speak to my parents. And if you so much as look at me the wrong way, I will call the district attorney myself and ensure you spend the rest of your miserable life eating prison food. Do you understand me, old man? I understand Preston. I sobbed loudly, burying my face in my hand to muffle the sound perfectly. Thank you. Thank you so much. You are a good man. I am so sorry I ever doubted you. Preston hung up the phone without another word. I lowered the phone from my ear. The tears instantly vanished. My breathing returned to a slow, calculated rhythm. I wiped my face and looked at the glowing monitors on my desk. The psychological manipulation was perfectly executed. I had just handed Preston the ultimate ego boost. By begging for his mercy and confirming my own total defeat, I erased all of his lingering paranoia. He no longer worried about me. He no longer worried about Maya resisting. He believed the board was completely cleared of all obstacles. And when an arrogant man believes he is completely invisible and entirely untouchable, he makes his final fatal move. I turned my attention to the financial tracking software monitoring his personal devices. Preston was acting exactly as I had predicted. The rush of power he felt from humiliating me over the phone gave him the false confidence he needed to finalize his getaway plan. He was not just planning to murder Maya on their honeymoon. He needed clean, untraceable cash waiting for him when he returned as a grieving widower. I watched my screen as Preston logged into his heavily encrypted offshore banking portal. He was accessing the last remnants of capital he had skimmed from his fake tech company investors. It was roughly $200,000. He had been hiding it in a dummy account in Delaware. He initiated a wire transfer. He was moving the entire $200,000 out of the United States and routing it into a numbered account in the Cayman Islands. He labeled the transfer as vendor payments for honeymoon logistics. He thought he was brilliantly laundering his last remaining liquid assets. He had no idea that I had already compromised his network architecture. As the data packets moved through the global financial system, my software silently intercepted the digital routing tags. I did not stop the transfer. I let the money flow exactly where he wanted it to go. But I attached a permanent, undeniable digital signature to the transaction. I linked the offshore transfer directly to the fraudulent syndicate loan documents. I effectively bound his hidden money to the forged signatures he had forced upon my daughter. The transfer completed successfully. Preston logged off thinking he had just secured his wealthy future. He was wrong. He had just handed me the final nail for his coffin. I had the motive. I had the financial evidence. I had the life insurance policy. And now I had the international wire fraud executed across federal lines. The storm was fully gathered, heavily armed, and waiting just over the horizon. He had 48 hours of freedom left. And then the quiet old man in the back row of the church was going to burn his entire world to the ground. The rehearsal dinner took place at the Harbor Point Yacht Club. It was an exclusive waterfront venue where the walls were lined with dark mahogany and the waiters wore white gloves. I arrived exactly on time, walking through the heavy brass doors wearing the same faded gray suit I had worn to the engagement party. I kept my posture hunched. I let my feet drag across the polished hardwood floors. I played the broken, defeated old man to absolute perfection. Preston and his family had reserved the grand dining room. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden light over tables covered in expensive white linen. When I entered the room, the ambient chatter died down for just a fraction of a second. The wealthy corporate guests, friends of the Sterling family, looked at me with a mixture of pity and mild disgust. I was the poor, unfortunate father of the bride. I was the charity case they had to tolerate for one evening before they could lock me away in a nursing home and forget I ever existed. Maya was seated at the head table next to Preston. She looked stunning in a simple white silk dress, but I could see the absolute terror hiding behind her makeup. Her eyes were hollow. Her posture was rigid. Preston had his arm draped casually over the back of her chair, his fingers resting dangerously close to her neck. He was broadcasting his ownership to the entire room. When he saw me walk in, his lips curled into a massive, arrogant smirk. He thought he had completely crushed my spirit. He thought my night in the holding cell had beaten me into total submission. They did not seat me at the head table with my daughter. They placed me at the very end of the room at a small corner table near the kitchen doors. It was a deliberate, calculated insult designed to remind me of my place in their new world order. I did not complain. I shuffled over to my assigned seat and sat down quietly. It was exactly where I wanted to be. The long white tablecloth draped heavily over my lap, providing the perfect visual cover. I reached into the inside pocket of my oversized suit jacket and pulled out a slim, matte black digital tablet. This was not a standard commercial device. It was a highly modified encrypted terminal tied directly to my servers in the basement. I rested the tablet flat on my thighs, hidden entirely from view. I connected to the secure proxy network using a biometric scan of my thumb. The interface for VR holdings booted up silently. I had work to do, and the arrogant fools in this room were about to give me the perfect distraction. Waiters began serving the first course, pouring expensive champagne into crystal flutes. The noise level in the room rose as the guests laughed and celebrated the union of a fraudulent tech billionaire and his hostage bride. I ignored the food placed in front of me. I stared at the glowing screen on my lap, bringing up the legal architecture of the Sterling family corporate empire. Richard Sterling stood up at the head table and tapped his silver spoon against his crystal champagne flute. The sharp ringing sound echoed through the grand dining room, demanding absolute silence. The guests quickly quieted down, turning their attention to the patriarch of the Sterling family. Richard buttoned his custom-tailored suit jacket and smiled warmly at the audience. He raised his glass toward Preston and Maya. Family and distinguished guests, Richard began, his voice booming with unearned authority. We are gathered here tonight to celebrate the merging of two lives, but more importantly, we are celebrating the future of the Sterling legacy. Preston has always been a visionary. He built a billion-dollar technology company from the ground up through sheer willpower and brilliant financial strategy. He is a man who knows exactly what he wants, and he never stops until he secures it. I kept my eyes fixed on my tablet. I opened the digital file containing the voluntary guardianship agreement that Richard and Patricia had forced me to sign at the country club. The document legally bound Preston to my financial identity. It was the trap they thought they had set for me. When Preston first told us he was marrying Maya, we were surprised Richard continued pacing slowly behind the head table. Maya comes from a very different world than we do. A much simpler world. A world where people work their entire lives just to survive paycheck to paycheck. It is a humble background, a modest background. But the Sterling family has always believed in philanthropy. We have always believed in elevating those who are less fortunate. A few guests chuckled softly, sipping their champagne. I felt a cold, calculated rage burn in my chest, but my hands remained perfectly steady on the digital tablet under the table. Richard turned his gaze across the room and pointed his champagne flute directly at me, sitting in the dark corner. "Look at Victor over there," Richard said, his voice dripping with condescension and fake sympathy. A man who worked hard for decades just to scrape by. A man who did not have the resources or the pedigree to give his daughter the life she truly deserved. "Victor, I want you to know that your struggle is over. You do not have to worry about Maya anymore. We are taking her into our world now. We will provide for her. And Preston, as your new legal guardian, will make sure that you are taken care of in a nice, quiet facility where you cannot hurt yourself. You can rest now, old man. The Sterling family is taking the burden off your tired shoulders." The room erupted into polite applause. Preston smiled broadly, looking incredibly proud of his father for publicly humiliating me. Maya stared at the table, her fists clenched so tight her knuckles were completely white. She was biting her lip, trying to hold back tears of shame and anger. I did not react to the insult. I simply lowered my head as if I was too embarrassed to meet their gaze. But beneath the tablecloth, my fingers were moving with lethal speed and absolute precision. Richard thought he was giving a victory speech. He did not realize he was reading his own financial obituary. When Preston established his fraudulent tech company, he needed institutional backing to open his corporate accounts. He used his father's main holding company, Sterling Global, as the primary underwriter. That meant Richard corporate assets were legally tied to Preston business accounts. Then, 2 days ago, Preston forced me to sign the voluntary guardianship papers. That document legally bound Preston personal and corporate assets to me. And yesterday, VR Holdings completely acquired the $5 million shadow syndicate loan, making me Preston's sole creditor. The legal chain was perfectly connected. I was the creditor, Preston was the debtor, and Richard was the underwriter. I opened the corporate debt consolidation protocol on my tablet. Because VR Holdings had officially called the $5 million loan, and Preston had failed to provide the $1 million good faith payment that afternoon, the loan was now in catastrophic default. According to the brutal terms of the original syndicate contract, which I now legally controlled, a default allowed the creditor to immediately collateralize the debt against any and all associated underwriting entities. Richard had spent his entire life hiding his wealth behind corporate shields, but he had willingly signed his name as the underwriter for his son, and his son had willingly signed his name as my guardian. They had built a bridge directly into their own fortress, and they handed me the keys. I initiated the hostile attachment order. I typed in the federal tax identification numbers for Sterling Global. I linked the massive fraudulent syndicate debt directly to Richard Primary Holding Company. I bypassed the standard commercial banking delays by routing the attachment order through the federal clearinghouse nodes I still had access to from my days hunting international money launderers. I am not just taking my son business to the next level, Richard boasted, raising his glass higher as his speech reached its climax. I am ensuring that the Sterling name remains a symbol of absolute power and limitless wealth for generations to come. Tomorrow my son marries a beautiful woman, and tomorrow we secure our empire forever. To Preston and Maya. To Preston and Maya, the wealthy guests echoed, raising their crystal glasses in unison. I looked at the glowing screen resting on my lap. The hostile attachment order was fully populated. The legal mechanisms were perfectly aligned. The syndicate debt, the environmental liability fines, and the federal wire fraud evidence were all consolidated into one massive financial smart bomb. I stared across the room at Richard. He was smiling, drinking his expensive champagne, basking in the glow of his own perceived greatness. He thought he was untouchable. He thought his money made him a god among men. I pressed the execute button on the tablet. The screen flashed green. Transfer accepted. Debt consolidated. Hostile attachment legally filed with the Federal Reserve Clearinghouse. The financial time bomb was officially armed. I locked the tablet and slipped it back into my suit jacket. I picked up my glass of tap water and took a slow, quiet sip. The champagne tasted sweet to them tonight, but it would taste like poison very soon. Because the banking system operates on a strict schedule. It was Friday night. The Federal Reserve Clearinghouse processes batch attachments over the weekend, but they do not execute the asset freezes until the market opens on the next business day. The bomb was quietly ticking down in the dark, counting the hours and the minutes. It would detonate exactly at 9 in the morning on Monday. Preston and Maya were getting married tomorrow. Preston thought he was going to walk down the aisle, secure the $10 million life insurance policy, and fly his hostage bride to Italy. He thought he had outsmarted the syndicate. He thought he had broken me completely. He had absolutely no idea that his entire existence had just been legally erased. I watched Preston lean over and forcefully kiss Maya on the cheek. I watched her flinch in terror. I felt a cold, dead calm settle over my mind. Let them drink their wine. Let them eat their expensive food. Let them laugh at the poor old black man sitting in the corner. They had 48 hours of artificial wealth left to enjoy. On Monday morning, every single bank account associated with the Sterling name would be frozen by federal mandate. They would have zero liquidity. They would have zero access to credit. The illusion would shatter, and the full weight of the federal government would crush them into the dirt. But I was not going to wait until Monday to save my daughter. The financial destruction was set, but the physical threat still remained. Tomorrow was the wedding. Tomorrow morning, Preston would try to lock me away and secure his prize. I finished my water and stood up from the corner table. I shuffled slowly toward the exit, ignoring the mocking whispers of the guests as I passed their tables. I pushed through the heavy brass doors and walked out into the cool ocean breeze. I had one more night to prepare the final strike. Tomorrow the fragile old man was going to die, and the federal hunter was going to walk into that church and burn their world to ashes. The morning of the wedding arrived with a suffocating, humid heat. I sat alone at my kitchen table drinking black coffee from a chipped ceramic mug. I wore my faded gray suit. The house was completely silent. I knew Preston would not leave my attendance to chance. He was a paranoid control freak who needed to orchestrate every single detail of his environment. He would never trust me to simply sit quietly in the back row of the church. He needed absolute certainty that I would not ruin his perfect high society wedding. At exactly 10 in the morning, a massive black luxury sport utility vehicle pulled into my driveway. The tires crushed the gravel with a heavy, aggressive sound. 2 men stepped out of the vehicle. They were young white men in their early 30s wearing immaculate custom-tailored tuxedos. They were Preston groomsmen. They reeked of inherited wealth and arrogant entitlement. One was tall and broad-shouldered with slicked-back dark hair. The other was shorter with a sharp rodent-like face and a cruel smile. They walked up my wooden porch steps and pounded their fists against my broken front door. I opened the door slowly, keeping my shoulders hunched forward. I looked at them with wide, fearful eyes, playing the part of the confused elderly man perfectly. "Hello, gentlemen," I said, my voice trembling with artificial frailty. "Are you here to take me to the church to see my daughter?" The tall one let out a loud, mocking laugh. It was a cold sound, completely devoid of any human empathy. "Yes, old man, we are here to take care of you," the tall one said, stepping aggressively into my hallway without asking permission to enter. "Preston wanted to make sure you got the special treatment today." The shorter man stepped inside and kicked the front door closed behind him. He looked around my modest living room with an expression of absolute disgust, as if simply breathing the air in my home was beneath his dignity. "Preston told us you were getting a little confused lately," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "He said you might try to wander off and embarrass Maya in front of the important guests. We are just here to make sure you stay put until the ceremony is completely over." "I do not understand," I whimpered, taking a clumsy step backward. "I promised Preston I would be good today. I just want to sit quietly and see my little girl get married." The tall one reached out and grabbed my upper arm. His grip was unnecessarily rough and violent. "You are not going anywhere near that church." He spat, his face inches from mine. "Preston does not want your pathetic, depressing face ruining the professional wedding photos. You are going to wait right here in this house. In fact, we are going to make absolutely sure you do not wander outside and cause a scene." He shoved me hard down the hallway, steering me directly toward the basement door. I stumbled forward, purposely dragging my feet against the hardwood floor to look as weak as possible. "Please do not do this," I cried out, letting a pathetic whine escape my throat. "It is dark down there. My knees are bad. I cannot walk down those stairs." The shorter man reached into my jacket pocket and snatched my cellular phone. "We will be taking this with us," he smirked, holding the cheap plastic device in the air. "We cannot have you calling a cab and showing up to ruin the party. Now get down the stairs before we throw you down them." They opened the heavy steel door that led to my basement. The tall one shoved me forcefully between the shoulder blades. I pitched forward, catching my balance on the wooden handrail. I stumbled down the first few steps, letting out a loud, simulated cry of pain. "Have a nice time in the dark, old man," the tall one shouted down the gloomy stairwell. "We will send someone to let you out tomorrow morning, if we remember." The heavy steel door slammed shut, sealing me in total darkness. The deadbolt clicked loudly into place. I heard the metallic slide of a heavy padlock engaging. They had brought their own industrial hardware to secure the door from the outside. I stood completely still and listened to their heavy footsteps walking away down the hallway. I heard the front door open and slam shut. I heard the powerful engine of their luxury vehicle start up and fade away down the suburban street. They were gone. They were heading to the church, believing they had flawlessly executed their wealthy friend instructions. I stood on the wooden stairs, enveloped in the absolute pitch-black darkness of the basement. The trembling in my hands stopped instantly. I straightened my spine, lifting my head high. I rolled my shoulders back and let out a deep, steady, calming breath. I reached into the hidden lining of my trousers and pulled out a small tactical flashlight. I clicked the button. A brilliant beam of white light illuminated the dusty wooden stairs and the concrete floor below. I walked down the remaining steps with steady, confident strides. Preston truly thought he was a strategic genius. He thought locking a 72-year-old black man in a dark basement was the ultimate foolproof insurance policy. He did not realize he had just locked me safely inside a highly secure federal-grade command center where I could operate completely undetected. But more importantly, he forgot one fundamental, undeniable truth about the property he was trying to steal. I built this house with my own bare hands in 1985. I poured this concrete foundation. I framed these structural walls. I knew every single hidden inch of this building. I did not even bother walking back up the stairs to test the heavy steel door. I walked straight past my hidden encrypted server racks and went directly to the back corner of the concrete foundation. Hidden carefully behind a stack of heavy cardboard boxes was the original exterior coal chute. It was a heavy iron door set directly into the thick concrete wall angled sharply upward toward the soft dirt of the backyard. It had not been opened or used in over 30 years. The iron was heavily rusted and the thick metal hinges were completely fused with decay. To an ordinary man, it was a solid, impenetrable wall. To a man who spent 40 years breaching fortified cartel compounds and breaking into secure offshore facilities, it was nothing more than a minor physical inconvenience. I reached under a nearby wooden workbench and pulled out a heavy steel crowbar and a pressurized canister of industrial chemical lubricant. I sprayed the rusted iron hinges generously, soaking the decayed metal. I wedged the sharp, flat edge of the crowbar deep into the narrow gap between the iron door and the concrete frame. I gripped the heavy steel bar with both hands. I am an older man, but muscle memory and structural leverage do not fade with age. I planted my boots firmly against the concrete wall and pushed down with my entire body weight. The rusted iron shrieked violently in protest. The hinges cracked and popped under the immense pressure. With one final aggressive shove, the iron door broke completely free from its frame and slammed backward into the dirt outside. Brilliant warm sunlight poured into the dark basement. I climbed up the steep concrete incline of the narrow chute. It was tight and coated in decades of black coal dust and dried earth. I pushed my shoulders through the opening and pulled my body out onto the soft green grass of my backyard. My faded gray suit was completely ruined, covered in thick black soot and wet brown mud. My hands were filthy. I stood up in the bright morning sun and brushed the heavy dirt from my knees. The frail, defeated old man died right there in the mud. I left him in the dirt where Preston thought I belonged. I walked across the manicured backyard, heading straight toward my detached garage. I bypassed the rusted old Ford truck parked in the driveway and walked to the solid back wall of the structure. I grabbed a heavy wooden tool cabinet and slid it to the side, revealing a flush steel door locked with a modern biometric keypad. I pressed my thumb firmly against the glowing scanner. The heavy door clicked open, revealing a pristine, climate-controlled, secure storage vault that I had maintained for years. I stepped inside and stripped off the dirty, ruined gray suit, throwing it onto the floor. I washed my hands and my face thoroughly in the deep utility sink, scrubbing the dirt from my skin. I dried off with a clean towel and walked over to the heavy mahogany wardrobe standing in the corner of the vault. For years, I had played the part of the invisible working-class father. I wore cheap discount clothes to make Preston feel superior and secure. I made myself look small so his massive, fragile ego would feel big. But today was not about hiding in the shadows. Today was about absolute, undeniable, devastating power. I unzipped a protective garment bag hanging inside the wardrobe. Inside rested a custom-tailored charcoal gray Italian suit crafted from the finest Super 180 wool. It cost $4,000 and it fit like absolute armor. I put on a crisp, bright white Egyptian cotton shirt and fastened the cuffs with heavy platinum links. I slipped my arms into the tailored jacket. It sat perfectly across my broad shoulders, easily hiding the tactical leather holster positioned securely against my ribs. I strapped a heavy vintage luxury watch around my left wrist. I slid my feet into polished black leather Oxfords that shone like glass. I looked at myself in the full-length mirror mounted on the wardrobe door. The man staring back was not a helpless victim. He was not a charity case. He was a highly lethal federal operative dressed impeccably to dismantle a fraudulent empire. I reached into the hidden compartment of my travel bag and pulled out my primary secure satellite phone. The decoy phone Preston groomsman took was a worthless piece of plastic from a convenience store. I dialed a local encrypted number. It rang exactly once. "The vehicle is ready." "Mr. Rollins." A deep professional voice answered immediately. "Bring it to the back alley behind the garage." I instructed, my voice sharp and commanding. "We are going to a wedding." I walked out of the garage vault and stood in the shaded alleyway. 2 minutes later, a flawless black armored sport utility vehicle pulled smoothly up to the curb. The heavily tinted windows rolled down, revealing a serious driver wearing a dark suit and dark sunglasses. I opened the heavy reinforced passenger door and climbed into the luxurious leather back seat. "Take me to the First Presbyterian Church," I told the driver, looking straight ahead. "And drive fast. I have a massive debt to collect. I am Victor. I am 72 years old, and I spent 40 years hunting down the worst financial criminals in America for the Internal Revenue Service. My daughter thought she was marrying a billionaire tech genius, but at her engagement party, while the champagne flowed and the cameras flashed, her future husband stepped outside to take a phone call. That was when my brilliant, beautiful daughter grabbed my arm, her hands trembling like leaves in a winter storm, and whispered 5 words that made my blood run cold. "Dad, please investigate him." Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe a father's intuition is never wrong. The armored sport utility vehicle glided smoothly through the historic district of Atlanta. The streets were lined with towering oak trees and expensive townhouses. We approached the First Presbyterian Church. It was a massive Gothic stone structure with towering stained glass windows and heavy oak doors. Preston had spared absolutely no expense. He was using the last of his stolen funds to project the ultimate illusion of wealth and power. The street in front of the church was lined with luxury cars. Valets were running back and forth, parking imported sports cars and black sedans. The entire block had been locked down for the social event of the season. The fraudulent tech billionaire was getting married. My driver pulled the vehicle right up to the front steps directly into the fire lane. He put the vehicle in park and stepped out quickly. He opened my door. I stepped out into the warm afternoon sun. I adjusted the cuffs of my tailored charcoal Italian suit. The fabric felt like a second skin. For years I had worn cheap, ill-fitting clothes to make my daughter's arrogant boyfriend feel superior. I had hidden my physical strength and my financial power behind a carefully constructed mask of poverty and old age. I had let them treat me like garbage. I had let them lock me in a dark basement. That time was over. The mask was completely gone. I walked up the wide stone steps toward the main entrance of the church. 2 young ushers in designer tuxedos were standing by the heavy oak doors. They looked at me with wide eyes. They did not recognize the frail old man who had been shoved into a basement just 3 hours ago. They saw a tall, broad-shouldered man radiating absolute authority and lethal confidence. They stepped aside nervously and pulled the heavy wooden doors open for me. The interior of the church was magnificent. The ceiling vaulted high into the air. The pews were packed with hundreds of wealthy guests. Venture capitalists, corporate lawyers, and high society elites filled every single seat. The massive pipe organ was playing the traditional wedding march. The deep, resonant chords shook the floorboards. The atmosphere was incredibly tense. I stood in the entryway and looked down the long center aisle. At the far end of the church stood the altar. It was covered in cascading arrangements of expensive white roses, and standing right in the center of it all was Preston Sterling. He looked like a king surveying his conquered territory. He wore a flawless white tuxedo jacket and a smug, greedy smile. He was bouncing slightly on his heels, completely high on his own perceived brilliance. He believed he had won. He believed the shadow syndicate was handled. He believed the old man was locked away in the dark. He believed the $10 million life insurance policy was only a few signatures away from being fully activated. Then I looked at the bride walking slowly down the center aisle. My beautiful, brilliant daughter Maya was halfway down the aisle. She wore a stunning white silk wedding gown that dragged gracefully across the polished stone floor. But there was absolutely no joy in her face. Her skin was pale and completely drained of color. Her eyes were hollow and fixed straight ahead. Her hands were shaking so violently that the white bouquet she was holding vibrated with her terror. She was not walking toward her future. She looked exactly like a hostage marching directly toward her execution. She was walking toward a man who planned to push her off a rocky cliff in Italy to pay off his criminal debts. She took another slow, agonizing step. I stepped forward into the center aisle. I did not sneak in. I did not wait for an invitation. I let the heavy oak doors slam shut behind me with a massive booming thud that echoed like a cannon shot through the cavernous church. The sound was deafening. The organist jumped in surprise and his hands slipped off the keys. The majestic wedding march ground to a sudden chaotic and discordant halt. The sudden silence in the massive church was absolute and terrifying. Hundreds of heads turned simultaneously to look at the back of the church. The wealthy guests murmured in confusion. Maya stopped walking. She turned her head and looked back down the aisle. When she saw me standing there, her hollow, terrified eyes widened in absolute shock. She let out a small, breathless gasp. The bouquet of white roses slipped from her trembling hands and hit the stone floor with a soft thud. I began to walk down the aisle. I did not shuffle. I did not limp. I walked with the heavy, measured, and predatory strides of a federal agent entering a hostile environment. The hard leather soles of my polished Oxfords cracked against the stone floor like a ticking clock. Click, click, click. The guests sitting in the pews shrank back as I passed them. The sheer force of my presence cleared the air around me. I kept my eyes locked completely on Preston Sterling. I watched the arrogant smile completely melt off his face. His jaw dropped. His blue eyes widened in pure, unadulterated panic. He looked past me toward the back doors, expecting to see the 2 groomsmen he had sent to lock me in the basement. They were standing near the front row, staring at me with expressions of pure horror. They had no idea how the frail old man had escaped the heavy steel door. They had no idea who this imposing man in the expensive suit was. I continued my march down the aisle. I passed the front row where Richard and Patricia Sterling were sitting. They had spent the entire rehearsal dinner mocking my modest background and my supposed dementia. They had forced me to sign a toxic property deed thinking they were stealing my home. Now they stared up at me completely paralyzed. Patricia raised a trembling hand to her diamond necklace. Richard turned pale and opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. They realized in that exact moment that they had made a catastrophic miscalculation. I stopped walking when I reached the end of the aisle. I stood exactly 10 feet away from the altar, placing myself firmly between Maya and Preston. I did not look at my daughter. I kept my eyes fixed on the man who wanted to murder her. Preston's face shifted rapidly from panic to absolute fury. His massive, fragile ego could not process the reality of the situation. He refused to accept that his flawless plan was falling apart in front of hundreds of his wealthy peers. He reverted instantly to his default defense mechanism. He tried to project dominance. He tried to humiliate me. "What the hell are you doing here?" Preston shouted, his voice cracking slightly with hysteria. His face turned bright red. He pointed a shaking finger at my chest. "I told you to stay away from us. You are sick in the head. You are a dangerous, senile old fool, and you are ruining my wedding." The crowd gasped at his outburst. Whispers erupted across the church. The guests did not understand what was happening, but they could feel the violent tension radiating from the altar. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply stood there, radiating cold mechanical authority. My silence infuriated him even more. Preston lunged forward, taking 2 aggressive steps down from the altar. He completely abandoned his pristine groom persona. He looked like a rabid dog backed into a corner. Security Preston roared, turning his head toward the side aisles. "Get this crazy old man out of here right now. He is having a psychotic episode. Grab him and throw him out into the street. I want him arrested for trespassing." 4 large men wearing tight black suits and earpieces immediately stepped out from the shadows near the vestry. They were the private security contractors Preston had hired to guard his extravagant event. They moved quickly down the steps, cracking their knuckles and reaching for my arms, intending to drag me out of the church by force. The 2 groomsmen who had locked me in the basement also stepped forward, eager to finish the job they had botched that morning. Maya screamed and tried to run toward me. "Dad, look out," she cried. I did not retreat. I did not assume a fighting stance. I stood perfectly still. I looked Preston directly in the eyes, and I slowly raised my right hand into the air. It was a simple, silent command. Instantly, the dynamic in the church violently shifted. From the second row of the pews directly behind Richard and Patricia, 2 massive men stood up simultaneously. They were not wearing cheap security uniforms. They were wearing tailored dark suits, and they moved with the flawless, synchronized precision of elite federal operatives. They were men I had called in from my old unit, men who owed me their careers, men who knew exactly how to handle a physical threat. They stepped smoothly over the wooden pew and placed themselves directly between me and Preston approaching security team. They did not shout. They did not posture. They simply formed an impenetrable wall of solid muscle and federal authority. The lead operative, a man named Marcus, casually unbuttoned his suit jacket, revealing the heavy steel of a tactical firearm resting in a shoulder holster. He looked at Preston, 4 security guards with absolute dead-eyed calm. "Take one more step toward this man," Marcus said, his voice low and incredibly dangerous. "I promise you it will be the last mistake you make today." Preston hired security guards froze instantly. They were paid to bounce unruly wedding guests and deal with paparazzi. They were not paid to engage in a gunfight with federal operatives inside a church. They immediately raised their hands and backed away, retreating to the edges of the room. The two arrogant groomsmen stopped dead in their tracks, turning completely pale and scrambling back to their seats. The church fell into a deathly, suffocating silence. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Preston stood on the altar, completely isolated and entirely exposed. His security force was neutralized. His physical intimidation tactics were utterly useless. He looked at the two operatives blocking his path, and then he looked back at me. His chest heaved up and down as the absolute reality of his situation finally crushed him. The frail old man was a phantom. The victim he thought he had buried in the basement was actually the predator who had just locked the doors of the church. I slowly lowered my hand and stepped around the operatives. I walked directly up the marble steps of the altar until I was standing inches away from Preston Sterling. The execution was ready to begin. I stood face to face with Preston Sterling on the polished marble altar of the First Presbyterian Church. The air between us felt incredibly heavy and suffocating. The hundreds of wealthy guests sitting in the wooden pews behind me held their collective breath. The silence was so absolute that I could hear the frantic beating of Preston's heart. He was trapped and he knew it, but his massive, fragile ego refused to accept total defeat. He still believed he possessed the ultimate trump card. He stepped closer to me, closing the distance until we were only inches apart. He tried to maintain his posture of superiority. He lowered his face and spoke in a venomous, desperate whisper, meant only for my ears. "You are making a massive mistake, old man," Preston whispered, his breath shaking. "You think bringing your federal muscle here changes anything. It changes absolutely nothing. I still hold the $5 million debt. I still have the forged signatures. If you do not turn around and walk out of those heavy oak doors right now, I will destroy your daughter. I will trigger the loan default today. I will send her to federal prison, and I will make sure she rots there for the rest of her life." I did not blink. I did not take a single step backward. I looked directly into his desperate blue eyes, and I felt absolutely nothing but cold, mechanical resolve. He was playing a hand of cards that I had already burned to ashes. I reached inside the breast pocket of my tailored charcoal Italian suit. I moved my hands slowly and deliberately. Every single eye in the cavernous church was fixed entirely on my movements. I pulled out a thick, heavy black leather folder. I lifted it high enough for everyone in the front rows to see clearly. Then I dropped it directly onto the center of the polished marble altar. The heavy thud echoed loudly through the silent church. The sudden sharp sound made Preston physically flinch. I reached out and flipped the black leather cover open. Inside the folder rested a thick stack of crisp white legal documents. They were not photocopies. They were the original bearer bonds, the original Shadow Syndicate loan agreements, and the original $10 million life insurance policy that he had secretly taken out on my daughter. I looked at Preston. I did not whisper back to him. I drew a deep breath, filling my lungs, and I let my voice project across the entire church. I spoke with the booming, undeniable authority of a federal agent issuing a final, absolute judgment. "You do not hold the debt, Preston," I said. My voice bounced off the vaulted stone ceiling, reaching every single guest sitting in the very back row. "You hold absolutely nothing. You are bankrupt. You are a fraud. And your $5 million syndicate loan is now the exclusive property of VR Holdings." Preston stared down at the documents resting on the marble altar. He saw the Apex Capital Solutions corporate logo. He saw his own sloppy signature written in black ink. He saw the bright red federal stamps indicating a total transfer of legal ownership. His brain struggled desperately to process the impossible reality sitting right in front of him. "VR Holdings," he whispered, his voice trembling violently. "The proxy company that bought my debt. The company that called the loan yesterday afternoon." "Yes," I said, my voice slicing through the silent church like a perfectly sharpened blade. "VR stands for Victor Rollins. I bought your debt, Preston. I bought it in cash. I own your fraudulent tech company. I own your overdrawn bank accounts. I own the $10 million life insurance policy you took out on my daughter with the deliberate intention of murdering her on your honeymoon in Italy. I am your sole creditor, and your massive loan is currently in catastrophic default." I stepped 1 inch closer, forcing him to lean backward against the expensive arrangements of white roses. For months, you thought you were a strategic genius. I continued projecting my voice so the entire congregation could hear his crimes. You thought you were manipulating a helpless young woman and a senile old black man. You forged Maya's signature to secure $5 million from a criminal shadow syndicate because your wealthy investors finally realized you were a complete failure. You threatened to destroy her medical license. You beat me in my own living room and had me arrested by the local police thinking it would secure your final leverage. You thought your money and your arrogance made you an untouchable god. Preston tried to speak, but his throat was completely dry. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. But you did not know who you were dealing with, I said, leaning forward. You did not know that I spent 40 years hunting down international money launderers and financial terrorists for the federal government. I have personally dismantled cartels with more money and more power than your entire pathetic family lineage combined. You thought you were the predator, Preston, but you were just a loud, arrogant fish swimming blindly into a steel net I cast the exact moment you disrespected my daughter. I pointed a steady finger at the heavy black folder resting on the altar. I purchased your debt for $6 million cash, I declared. I triggered the default yesterday. I legally own every single asset you possess. And because you arrogantly forced me to sign those voluntary guardianship papers last night at the country club, you legally attached your own corporate accounts to a $12 million federal environmental liability. I did not just buy your debt, Preston. I financially executed you. You have zero liquidity. You have zero leverage. You have absolutely nothing left in this world. The tense silence in the church shattered completely. The wealthy guests sitting in the wooden pews erupted into a massive collective gasp of pure horror. Venture capitalists, corporate investors, and high society elites began whispering frantically to each other. They were witnessing the live, brutal public dismantling of a man they thought was a rising star in the technology industry. The illusion of Preston Sterling, the billionaire tech genius, was actively disintegrating in front of Atlanta elite high society. Preston's physical appearance deteriorated rapidly. His face lost every single drop of color. His skin turned a sickly pale shade of gray. He began to sweat profusely, soaking the collar of his expensive dress shirt. His knees buckled slightly under his own weight, and he had to grab the sharp edge of the marble altar just to keep himself from collapsing onto the floor. He looked exactly like a man who had just been diagnosed with a terminal illness. His pristine white tuxedo suddenly looked like a cheap clown costume. The smug, greedy smile that he wore when I walked through the doors was gone forever, replaced entirely by a look of absolute, inescapable terror. I looked past his trembling shoulder and saw Maya. She was standing a few feet away, clutching the fabric of her white silk wedding dress. The hollow, terrified look in her beautiful eyes had completely vanished. She looked at the official documents resting on the altar, and then she looked directly at me. Tears of absolute pure relief streamed down her face. She realized in that exact moment that the invisible steel chains binding her to this monster had just been shattered into a million tiny pieces. The forged documents could no longer be used against her because her father possessed them. She was safe. She was finally completely free. I turned my attention back to the broken, trembling man standing in front of me. I leaned in close, making sure my voice was low and perfectly clear. "You told my daughter that I would die in a prison cell, Preston," I whispered coldly. "You told her she had to marry you today to save my life, but the only person going to federal prison today is you." Preston stared at me. His entire body shook. He was completely out of options. He was completely out of money. The illusion had shattered, and the crushing weight of reality had finally arrived to collect its ultimate due. The public confrontation had ripped away every single layer of protection he had ever built, leaving him completely exposed in front of the entire world. I am Victor. I am 72 years old, and I spent 40 years hunting down the worst financial criminals in America for the Internal Revenue Service. My daughter thought she was marrying a billionaire tech genius. But at her engagement party, while the champagne flowed and the cameras flashed, her future husband stepped outside to take a phone call. That was when my brilliant, beautiful daughter grabbed my arm, her hands trembling like leaves in a winter storm, and whispered 5 words that made my blood run cold. "Dad, please investigate him." Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe a father's intuition is never wrong. The silence in the church was heavy and absolute. I watched the realization of total financial ruin wash over Preston Sterling. He was paralyzed, clutching the edge of the marble altar, unable to comprehend that his entire world had just been legally erased. But the Sterling family arrogance ran deep. It was a genetic trait passed down from generation to generation. While Preston was completely broken, his father was not ready to surrender. From the front row of the wooden pews, Richard Sterling stood up. His face was flushed with a violent shade of dark red. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving under his custom-tailored suit. Richard had spent his entire life surrounded by yes-men and corporate lawyers who shielded him from any real consequences. He simply could not process the idea that a retired black man from a modest neighborhood could walk into his son's high-society wedding and systematically dismantle their multi-million-dollar empire. In his mind, it was absolutely impossible. Richard stepped out of the pew and began marching up the center aisle. He stomped his expensive leather shoes against the stone floor, projecting an aura of desperate false authority. He climbed the marble steps of the altar and positioned himself directly between me and his trembling son. He threw his shoulders back and puffed out his chest, trying to physically intimidate me. "This is an absolute outrage," Richard shouted, his voice echoing through the massive cavernous church. He turned his head to address the hundreds of wealthy guests sitting in the pews behind me. "Do not listen to a single word this man is saying. He is a broke, delusional old fool. He is a bitter, jealous man who cannot stand the fact that my son is wealthy and successful. He is having a severe mental breakdown and hallucinating these ridiculous financial fantasies." I stood perfectly still and watched Richard rant. I did not interrupt him. I let him dig his grave deeper in front of all his country club friends and venture capitalist investors. "You are trespassing on private property, Victor," Richard sneered, turning his furious gaze back to me. "You stole some meaningless paperwork and you forged a fake corporate folder to create a scene and ruin my son's perfect day. I am going to call my legal team right now. I am going to bury you in so many defamation lawsuits that you will spend the rest of your miserable life paying off my legal fees. You are nothing but a pathetic old man, and you are completely out of your league." I looked at Richard with a cold, mechanical stare. Wealthy criminals are incredibly predictable. When you trap them in a corner and strip away their leverage, they always fall back on the exact same empty threats. They threaten to sue you. They threaten to destroy your reputation. They try to use their money as a weapon because they have absolutely no other skills to rely on. But Richard did not have any money left. He just did not know it yet. I slowly reached inside the breast pocket of my tailored charcoal suit jacket. I kept my movements deliberate and highly controlled. I pulled out a single sheet of crisp white paper. It was not part of the heavy black folder resting on the altar. It was a separate document printed on highly secure watermarked paper. It bore the official, undeniable seal of the United States Federal Reserve Clearinghouse and the distinct eagle emblem of the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. I held the document out and calmly extended my hand toward Richard. He looked at the paper with absolute disgust. He snatched it out of my hand, intending to crumple it up and throw it onto the floor. But as his eyes locked onto the bold black letters printed across the top of the page, his hands froze. He saw the federal seals. He saw his own name printed in capital letters. He saw the name of his primary holding company, Sterling Global. I did not raise my voice, but I spoke with enough resonant authority that every single person in the front rows could hear my words clearly. "You do not have a legal team anymore, Richard," I said, my tone flat and completely devoid of any sympathy. "You do not have the funds to pay them." Richard stared at the paper, his eyes darting frantically across the legal text. "What is this?" he whispered, his voice suddenly losing all of its booming, arrogant volume. "What kind of fake document is this?" "That is an official federal attachment order," Richard first explained, stepping 1 inch closer to him. "When your son decided to build his fraudulent tech company, he used Sterling Global as his primary financial underwriter. He legally tied your corporate assets to his business accounts. And last night, when you arrogantly forced me to sign those voluntary guardianship papers at the country club, you legally tied your son's personal assets directly to me." Richard swallowed hard. A bead of cold sweat rolled down his red forehead. The paper in his hands began to shake. "Because VR Holdings officially called your son $5 million syndicate loan yesterday afternoon, and he failed to pay the debt, entered catastrophic default." I continued, laying out the execution step by step. That default allowed me to cross-collateralize the debt against his underwriting entities. I attached his massive shadow syndicate debt directly to Sterling Global, and because those funds were originally procured through international wire fraud and illegal shell companies, the federal government has officially flagged your entire corporate network. You are lying, Richard gasped, shaking his head in frantic denial. You cannot do that. You do not have that kind of power. You are just a retired government worker. I am the man who just bought your entire life, I said coldly. Check your phone, Richard. Richard hesitated. He looked at his son Preston, who was still leaning against the altar looking like a ghost. He looked at the hundreds of guests watching them in total stunned silence. Slowly, his trembling hand reached into his suit pocket and pulled out his cellular phone. He unlocked the screen and opened his primary banking application. He tapped the screen to refresh his executive portfolio balances. I watched his face as the data loaded. The red error messages appeared instantly. Every single account was flagged with a federal code. His checking accounts, his corporate routing nodes, his offshore trust funds, and his domestic investment portfolios all displayed a balance of 0. The assets were not just empty. They were locked, seized, and entirely inaccessible. Your son used your company as collateral, Richard, I said, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper. As of 9 o'clock this morning, every single one of your accounts was frozen by the Internal Revenue Service for suspected money laundering and massive unmitigated debt default. You cannot buy a cup of coffee right now, let alone hire an army of corporate lawyers. Your empire is gone. You are completely, irrevocably bankrupt. The phone slipped from Richard's fingers and hit the marble floor with a sharp crack. His legs gave out beneath him. The mighty, arrogant patriarch of the Sterling family crumbled like a structure of dry clay. He dropped heavily to his knees on the hard stone of the altar. He clutched his chest, gasping for air, his mouth opening and closing in silent, absolute despair. He stared blankly at the floor, completely destroyed by the realization that his greed and his blind trust in his fraudulent son had just erased a lifetime of hoarded wealth. Preston watched his father collapse onto the marble. He looked at the frozen banking application on the shattered phone resting on the floor. He looked at the federal documents scattered across the altar. The final tether holding his sanity together snapped completely. He had lost the syndicate loan. He had lost his fraudulent company. He had lost the $10 million life insurance policy on my daughter. And now he had destroyed his father and bankrupted his entire family lineage. The illusion was dead. There was absolutely nothing left to protect and nothing left to lose. His shock mutated instantly into pure, unadulterated primal violence. He let out a loud, guttural roar that echoed terrifyingly through the church. It was the sound of a cornered, wild animal operating purely on instinct and hatred. "I will kill you!" Preston screamed, his face contorting into a mask of pure rage. He pushed off the marble altar and lunged directly at me. He threw his entire body weight forward, aiming to tackle me to the ground and tear me apart with his bare hands. He wanted to physically destroy the man who had methodically taken everything away from him. The guests in the front rows screamed in terror. My daughter Maya gasped, stepping back instinctively, but I did not flinch. I did not step back. I did not even blink. I am an older man, but I spent 4 decades engaging in close-quarters combat with men far more dangerous and far more skilled than a spoiled corporate fraud. Muscle memory is a permanent installation. It never fades. It only waits for the command to execute. As Preston hurtled toward me, blindly swinging his arms, I calmly shifted my center of gravity. I waited until the absolute last fraction of a second when his forward momentum was entirely committed and completely unstoppable. I pivoted sharply to my left, stepping smoothly out of his direct path. As he flew past me, swinging wildly at empty air, I extended my right leg and delivered a swift, brutal, sweeping kick to the back of his ankles. The perfectly timed leg sweep completely eradicated his base of support. Preston's legs flew up into the air and his upper body crashed violently downward. He slammed chest first onto the hard polished marble floor of the altar with a sickening heavy thud. The breath exploded forcefully from his lungs in a loud, ragged wheeze. Before he could even attempt to roll over or scramble back to his feet, I stepped forward. I raised my right leg and brought my foot down hard. I planted the solid wooden heel of my $4,000 custom-tailored Italian dress shoe firmly onto the center of his upper back, pinning him flat against the cold stone. I applied just enough downward pressure to keep him completely immobilized and struggling to draw breath. He weakly clawed at the marble floor, groaning in pain and total defeat beneath the weight of my polished shoe. I stood tall over his broken body, adjusting the cuffs of my suit jacket with absolute calm precision. I looked out over the massive crowd of wealthy elites who were staring at me in terrified, awestruck silence. The predator had been neutralized. The financial execution was complete. The physical confrontation was finished in less than 3 seconds. The king was dead, and I was the one standing on his chest. I kept my polished shoe planted firmly on the center of Preston Sterling's back. He was struggling to breathe against the hard marble floor of the altar. The church was trapped in a suffocating silence. Hundreds of wealthy guests stared at the spectacle unfolding in front of them. The illusion of the high society wedding was completely shattered. Then a new sound pierced the heavy atmosphere inside the massive stone building. It started as a faint wail in the distance. Within seconds, the sound multiplied and grew deafeningly loud. Sirens, multiple sirens approaching rapidly from every direction. The high-pitched screams of police cruisers and the heavy rumbling horns of federal tactical vehicles converged directly outside the heavy oak doors of the First Presbyterian Church. Preston stopped struggling beneath my shoe. He turned his head sideways against the cold stone and listened to the approaching sirens. A sick, twisted smile began to spread across his bruised and sweating face. His massive, fragile ego was desperately searching for a lifeline, and his delusional mind found one. He began to laugh. It was a wet, pathetic sound. He thought the police were here for me. He remembered the local precinct holding cell. He remembered that I had escaped from his basement. He genuinely believed that his wealth and his white privilege were about to save him from a black man standing on his chest. "You are finished, old man," Preston wheezed, his voice laced with arrogant malice. "You broke out of your house. You assaulted me again. You trespassed at my wedding. Those sirens are for you. I am going to press every single charge in the book. You are going to die in a federal penitentiary." I did not remove my shoe from his back. I did not respond to his pathetic threats. I simply looked past the altar toward the main entrance of the church. The heavy oak doors burst open with explosive force. The bright afternoon sunlight flooded into the dim, cavernous space. A massive contingent of law enforcement officers poured into the center aisle. There were uniformed local police officers, but they were not leading the charge. Leading the formation were a dozen men and women wearing dark tactical gear and navy blue windbreakers. The bright yellow letters printed across their backs read FBI. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had arrived to clean up the mess I had carefully orchestrated. The wealthy guests scrambled out of the way, pressing themselves against the wooden pews as the federal agents marched down the aisle in a flawless tactical formation. They moved with absolute purpose. They did not look at the screaming venture capitalists or the crying bridesmaids. Their eyes were locked directly on the altar. Preston saw the tactical gear and his smile grew even wider. He thought he was witnessing his own personal rescue mission. He tried to lift his head from the floor and began shouting orders at the approaching federal agents as if they were his own private security team. "Get him off of me," Preston screamed, pointing a shaking finger at my face. "Arrest this man immediately. He is a dangerous lunatic. He is holding me hostage. He forged federal documents and he is trying to steal my company. I am Preston Sterling, and I demand that you shoot this man if he does not comply." The lead federal agent walked straight up the marble steps of the altar. It was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a stern expression. He was a senior field director I had worked with on a dozen major financial crime task forces before I retired. He walked right past Richard Sterling, who was still kneeling on the floor, weeping over his frozen bank accounts. The lead agent stopped directly in front of me. He looked at my foot planted firmly on Preston's back. He looked at my custom-tailored charcoal suit. "Good afternoon, Victor," the lead agent said, his voice calm and highly respectful. "It looks like you caught a rather loud rat today." "Good afternoon, Agent Miller," I replied smoothly, lifting my foot and stepping back from Preston. "He is all yours." Preston rolled over and scrambled to his knees, gasping for air. He looked at Agent Miller, and then he looked at me. His brain completely short-circuited. He could not comprehend why the Federal Bureau of Investigation was speaking to me with such deep professional reverence. "What are you doing?" Preston shouted, his voice cracking in absolute panic. "Do not talk to him. Arrest him. He is a criminal." Agent Miller did not even blink. He looked down at Preston with absolute zero sympathy. He pulled a thick stack of folded warrants from his tactical vest. "Preston Sterling," Agent Miller announced, his voice projecting across the silent church. "You are under arrest. You are being charged with multiple counts of international wire fraud conspiracy to commit extortion, grand larceny, and federal document forgery. No, Preston screamed, crawling backward across the marble floor. No, you have the wrong man. He did this. Victor Rollins did this. Two federal agents stepped forward instantly. They grabbed Preston by the arms and hauled him violently to his feet. They slammed him face first against the polished stone wall behind the altar. Preston kicked and thrashed, screaming for his father to help him. But Richard could not help anyone. Two more agents were already pulling Richard up from the floor. Richard Sterling. Agent Miller continued, turning to the broken patriarch. You are also under arrest for conspiracy to commit money laundering and corporate fraud. Your assets have been officially seized by the United States government. The sharp, distinct sound of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting closed echoed loudly through the church. Click, click, click. The sound of absolute, undeniable justice. Preston sobbed uncontrollably as the cold steel bit into his wrists. His flawless white tuxedo was ruined, covered in dirt and sweat. The billionaire tech genius was officially dead, and the pathetic, desperate criminal was fully exposed for the entire world to see. They dragged him down the steps of the altar. He looked back at me one last time, his eyes wide with inescapable terror. He finally realized that he was never the predator. He was always the prey. I reached into the inner pocket of my suit jacket. I pulled out a small black metallic flash drive. It was the ghost drive containing the cloned data from his assistant computer. It held every single hidden ledger, every deleted email, and every piece of digital metadata, proving he had forged my daughter's signature on the $5 million syndicate loan. I held the drive out toward Agent Miller. Here is the complete chain of custody for the Apex Capital Solutions fraud, I said, placing the drive into his gloved hand. You will find the original metadata for the forged guarantee documents on the root directory. You will also find the communications regarding a very suspicious $10 million life insurance policy. I suggest you look into that very closely. Agent Miller secured the drive in an evidence bag and nodded deeply. Thank you, Victor. Your country owes you a massive debt of gratitude once again. Enjoy your retirement. The agents marched Preston and Richard down the long center aisle. The wealthy guests watched in horrified silence as their golden boys were paraded out of the church in heavy steel chains. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers outside illuminated the stained glass windows, painting the church in the colors of justice. I turned away from the spectacle. I did not care about Preston anymore. He was erased. I looked across the altar and saw my daughter. Maya was standing by the floral arrangements, clutching her chest. The paralyzing fear that had gripped her entire body for the last 2 months was completely gone. She looked at the empty space where her captor had just stood, and then she looked at me. Dad, she whispered, her voice breaking into a beautiful, massive sob. I opened my arms. Maya ran across the marble floor. Her white silk wedding dress flowed behind her. She threw herself into my arms, burying her face into my shoulder. I wrapped my arms tightly around her, holding my little girl safe and secure against my chest. She cried uncontrollably, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of absolute total relief. I have got you, baby, I whispered, resting my chin on top of her head. I have got you. It is over. He can never hurt you again. We stood there on the altar, holding each other, while the sirens wailed outside. The storm was finally over, and my daughter was completely safe. Preston Sterling did not go quietly into the night. He spent the first 6 months of his incarceration fighting a desperate and completely futile legal battle. He tried to blame his father for the corporate failures. He tried to blame the shadow syndicate for the extortion. He even tried to blame my daughter Maya, claiming she manipulated him into forging her signature. But the federal prosecutors had an airtight case. They possessed the ghost drive I had cloned from his assistant. They possessed the original forged syndicate loan documents I had acquired through VR Holdings. They had the recorded audio from my living room where he violently threatened me and confessed to his crimes. The justice system usually moves with agonizing slowness, but when it possesses absolute, unassailable proof, it strikes with devastating force. Preston stood in the federal courtroom in downtown Atlanta wearing a standard-issue bright orange jumpsuit. The vibrant color completely washed out his pale, arrogant complexion. His expensive haircuts and tailored Italian suits were gone forever. The federal judge presiding over the case did not show him a single ounce of mercy. The judge looked down from the bench and described Preston as a calculated, predatory sociopath who used financial terrorism to hold innocent people hostage. Preston was found guilty on all federal counts, including international wire fraud conspiracy to commit extortion and federal document forgery. The judge handed down a mandatory consecutive sentence of 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the slightest possibility of early parole. I sat quietly in the back row of the courtroom and watched the federal bailiffs lead him away in heavy iron chains. He did not look back at the gallery. His fragile ego was entirely shattered. His parents, Richard and Patricia Sterling, faced their own customized, inescapable nightmare. The toxic environmental liability I had legally attached to their primary holding company triggered a massive federal asset seizure. The Environmental Protection Agency and the Internal Revenue Service absolutely gutted their corporate empire within a matter of weeks. Their offshore bank accounts were drained completely dry to pay the mounting federal remediation fines. Their lucrative stock portfolios were forcibly liquidated by government auditors. Richard and Patricia were forced to declare total catastrophic corporate and personal bankruptcy. They lost their luxury imported cars, they lost their exclusive country club memberships, and eventually the federal government came for their absolute crown jewel. Their massive, sprawling mansion located in the most exclusive zip code of Atlanta was seized by the bank and immediately put up for public foreclosure auction. I attended that specific municipal auction. I did not wear my faded gray suit, and I did not wear my custom $4,000 Italian wool. I wore a simple, comfortable sweater and plain slacks. I stood completely unrecognized in the back of the crowded auditorium, and I raised my bidding paddle. I purchased the Sterling family mansion for absolute pennies on the dollar using clean, liquid funds routed from my secure Zurich trust account. Richard and Patricia had to pack their meager remaining belongings into cardboard boxes and move into a tiny rented apartment on the far outskirts of the city. But I did not buy their massive mansion to live in it myself. I have absolutely no desire to sleep in a house built on toxic arrogance and stolen wealth. I transferred the property deed of the mansion to a newly formed nonprofit foundation that I created in my late wife's honor. I hired a massive team of local contractors sourced entirely from my own working-class neighborhood. We completely gutted the property. We tore down the extravagant crystal chandeliers. We ripped up the imported marble floors. We converted the massive grand ballroom into an indoor basketball court and a comprehensive technology learning lab. We transformed the pristine formal dining room into a professional tutoring center and a college preparatory library. I turned the physical monument of Preston unearned arrogance into the Victor and Vivian Rollins Community Center for at-risk Black youth. The very same children that Richard and Patricia used to lock their car doors against are now learning computer programming and advanced financial literacy inside their former living room. We successfully turned their toxic vanity into a permanent generational blessing for our community. 6 months after the federal trial ended, Maya came to visit me at my house. The broken front door had been fully replaced. The shattered picture frame of her mother had been carefully repaired. The house was quiet and deeply peaceful again. Maya looked completely rejuvenated. The heavy dark circles under her beautiful eyes were entirely gone. The suffocating weight of Preston extortion had been lifted from her shoulders. She had returned to her surgical residency with renewed passion, and she was saving lives every single day. She was no longer a terrified hostage. She was a powerful, independent trauma surgeon who had survived a terrible emotional storm. We sat together on the old wooden front porch, drinking cold, sweet iced tea as the evening sun began to set over the quiet suburban neighborhood. The warm Georgia breeze gently rustled the green leaves in the large oak tree standing in my front yard. I looked at my daughter, and I knew it was finally time to tell her the entire truth. I set my glass down on the small wooden table between our rocking chairs. "Maya," I said, my voice soft and perfectly steady, "there are things about me and your mother that you do not know. Things we kept deliberately hidden from you to protect your future." Maya looked at me with a calm, curious expression. She already knew I was not just a retired civil servant. She had seen me command elite federal agents inside the church. She had seen me systematically dismantle a fraudulent billionaire. I explained everything to her. I told her about my decades of dangerous undercover work hunting international financial criminals for the government. I told her about the secure offshore accounts and the aggressive silent investments her mother and I had made over the decades. I told her that she was the sole legal heir to a highly protected, highly insulated $20 million fortune. I watched her process the heavy information. She did not look angry. She did not look betrayed. She simply looked at the peeling white paint on the wooden porch railing and smiled a soft, knowing smile. "Why did you never tell me, Dad?" she asked quietly. "Why did we live in this small, modest house when you could have bought us absolutely anything in the world?" I reached out and took her hand. I squeezed her long, delicate fingers gently. "Because wealth is a highly corrosive poison if you do not know who you truly are before you receive it," I explained. "Your mother and I wanted you to build your own strong character. We wanted you to learn the undeniable value of hard work, of intense dedication, and of genuine human empathy. If you grew up in a massive mansion surrounded by unlimited money and false friends, you might have ended up exactly like Preston. You might have believed that your financial net worth was the only thing that gave you value as a human being. We wanted you to be a brilliant surgeon because you cared deeply about healing people, not because you wanted a fancy title. We lived simply so you would grow up to be extraordinarily rich in your heart." Maya leaned over and rested her head on my shoulder, just like she used to do when she was a little girl. She hugged my arm tightly. "You and Mom did exactly the right thing," she whispered into my shirt. "I do not want a massive mansion, Dad. I just want you." I patted her hand and looked out over the quiet, peaceful street. We sat there together in comfortable silence as the streetlights flickered on. I had $20 million sitting securely in a Swiss bank account. I owned a massive, bustling community center across town. I had the power to destroy entire corrupt corporations with a single digital keystroke. But sitting on that old wooden porch with my brilliant daughter safe and happy beside me, I knew I already possessed everything I could ever possibly need. Never mistake a quiet man for a weak one, and never assume that simple clothes hide a simple mind. In this world, the loudest people are usually the emptiest, desperately shouting to hide their own bankruptcy, both financial and moral. I spent my life building real power so that I would never have to brag about it, but I never hesitated to use it when my family was threatened. True wealth is not the ability to buy expensive things, it is the power to protect the people you love. Family is built on honesty, not extortion, and greedy men will always eventually sign their own destruction. Thank you for listening to my story today. If you found value in this lesson, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories of justice and truth. Leave a comment below and let me know how you would have handled Preston and his family. Stay safe, stay vigilant, and always protect the people you love.